She humiliated an elderly black woman at the pool. Her son wore a Navy SEAL trident. The moment I heard my mother scream, I dropped every bag of groceries on the driveway and ran. And what I found at that community pool will haunt me for the rest of my life. A white woman in a visor and a whistle around her neck standing over my 74-year-old mother like she was a criminal, pointing her finger 2 inches from Mama's nose, shouting for everyone at the pool to hear, "You don't belong here." My mother, Dorothy Mae Williams, who raised 4 children on her own, who never once asked anyone for a handout, who prayed every morning and still pressed her church clothes. The night before, was sitting in a pool chair with her feet barely in the water, wearing the swimming cap my brother Marcus bought her for her birthday, and she was shaking. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't fighting back. She was just shaking and trying not to cry in front of strangers. The woman's name was Sandra Pruitt, HOA president of Maplewood Ridge Estates, self-appointed queen of every rule, real and invented, and she looked right at me when I ran up and said, with a smile so thin it could cut glass, "You might want to get your guest under control before I call the non-emergency line." That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about pool rules. This was never about pool rules. My name is Renee Williams Carter. I'm 46, a registered nurse, and 3 years ago I bought the house at 14 Birchwood Lane, the one with the blue shutters and the hydrangeas out front. With every dollar I had saved over 20 years of night shifts and overtime. It was the first home I ever owned. I cried in the parking lot of the title company when I signed the papers. Maplewood Ridge is a nice neighborhood. Quiet streets, good schools. Everybody waves from their driveways. When I moved in, my neighbor Patty brought over a casserole and the HOA welcome packet in the same trip, which I thought was sweet. The community pool was one of the main reasons I chose this place. I pictured Mama coming over on summer Saturdays, floating in the shallow end, letting her arthritis rest. Marcus was the one who first told me to watch out for Sandra. "I've heard about her type," he said when he visited that first Thanksgiving. HOA president who thinks the neighborhood is her personal property. You see that kind all the time in these planned communities. I laughed it off. I was new. I wanted to give people the benefit of the doubt. That was mistake number 1. Mama, Dorothy, had been staying with me since February, when her apartment building in Gary, Indiana flooded and her landlord dragged his feet on repairs. It was supposed to be temporary. But she settled into the guest room like she'd always been there, watering my plants, rearranging my pantry, leaving church radio on low all morning. Having her there made the house feel like a home in a way it hadn't quite been before she arrived. I first met Sandra Pruitt at the March HOA meeting, which I attended because the notice was slipped under my door and I figured it was the neighborly thing to do. Sandra stood at the front of the community room in a blazer and pearls like she was chairing a congressional hearing, not a neighborhood association meeting about parking and landscaping. She had a gavel, an actual wooden gavel. She used it 4 times in 90 minutes. Sandra introduced herself to me after the meeting not with warmth, but with the careful, evaluating look of someone doing an inspection. She shook my hand, smiled, and said, "We're so glad to have new homeowners who take an interest in community standards." It sounded like a compliment, felt like a warning. I thanked her and didn't read too much into it. Mistake number 2. The first hint that something was off came in April, when I found a formal HOA notice taped to my front door. Not in my mailbox, taped directly to the door, citing me for unsanctioned potted plants on the front stoop. I had 2 terracotta pots with petunias that I'd bought at Home Depot. I checked the HOA guidelines. There was no rule about potted plants. I emailed Sandra to clarify. She replied the same day, "The architectural committee will review at the next meeting." At the April meeting, Sandra announced a new addendum to the community guidelines. Decorative items on exterior stoops must not exceed 12 inches in height and must conform to neutral color palettes. She presented it as if it had been in development for months. She made eye contact with me exactly once during the reading, and it was just long enough to make sure I understood. I voted against it, passed 4-1. The committee was Sandra, her husband, and 2 women who carpooled with her every morning. My neighbor Patty caught me on the sidewalk after that meeting and said, quietly, "She does this to everyone who pushes back. First the small stuff, then it gets bigger." Patty had lived on Birchwood Lane for 11 years. She'd watched 3 families leave the street, she said, in part because of Sandra. 2 of them were black families, Patty added, and then looked at me with an expression that said she was sorry she had to say it, and sorrier still that it might be relevant. I didn't want to believe Patty. I am not someone who leads with suspicion. I have spent my entire adult life giving people the benefit of the doubt, sometimes to my own detriment. I told myself Sandra was just one of those control freak HOA types you read about on Reddit, equal opportunity obnoxious, no particular agenda beyond her own ego. I moved my petunias inside and let it go. But I started keeping copies of everything she sent me. In May, Sandra knocked on my door on a Saturday morning to inform me that my welcome mat was non-compliant. It was the wrong shade of tan, apparently, and the new color palette rule, which she had now committed to memory and could recite verbatim, applied to exterior textiles as well as planters. I asked her to show me the written rule. She said it was implied. I asked her to put that in writing. Her face did something complicated, and she left without another word. That same week, I reached out to a woman named Gloria Tate, a former HOA board member whose name I found in old meeting minutes I'd requested from the county. Gloria had served on the board for 6 years before resigning. She met me for coffee at the Starbucks on Route 9 and within 10 minutes said, "Whatever she's doing to you, document everything. Dates, times, exact words. She's very good at making things sound reasonable until they're not." Gloria didn't elaborate much, but she looked tired in a specific way that told me more than her words did. June came and Mama arrived from Gary with 2 suitcases, her Bible, and a Tupperware container of her cornbread that survived the 4-hour drive miraculously intact. The guest room had its own bathroom and a window that faced the backyard. Mama stood at that window the first morning and said, "Baby, you did real good." Those 4 words meant more to me than the deed itself. I added Mama to my HOA guest registration, because yes, there was a guest registration process, which Sandra had instituted 2 years prior, and which required a form, a copy of photo ID, and a 7 to 10 business day approval window for any guest staying longer than 2 weeks. I submitted everything within 3 days of Mama's arrival. Sandra acknowledged receipt. 3 weeks passed and I heard nothing. I followed up. Sandra replied, "Under review." In late June, the community pool opened for the season. It was a beautiful Saturday, 88 degrees, low humidity, the kind of day that feels like a gift. I had a 12-hour shift starting at 6 the next morning, so I couldn't go with Mama, but she said she was fine. She had her swimsuit, her cap, her sunscreen, and her temporary resident pool pass, which the HOA office had finally issued after I sent a 3rd follow-up email. She walked 2 blocks to the pool by herself. I watched her from the front porch until she turned the corner. 40 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Mama's voice, very quiet, very careful. The voice she uses when she's trying not to fall apart in front of people, saying, "Renee, honey, I think you need to come to the pool." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my keys, then remembered I just unloaded groceries, left those on the driveway, and ran. What I found when I got there. My mother sitting on the edge of a lounge chair, her towel still folded in her lap, her pool pass visible on the table beside her, and Sandra Pruitt standing over her with a clipboard and an expression that I can only describe as satisfied. There were maybe 15 people at the pool. Every single one of them was watching. None of them had said a word. Sandra turned to me when I walked through the gate and said, with the kind of practiced calm that comes from never having been told no, "Your guest does not have the correct documentation for pool use. The temporary pass is for the fitness center, not the pool. Pool access requires a separate application." I looked at the pass on the table. It said, in plain English, Community Amenities, Pool and Fitness Center. I read it out loud. Sandra's jaw tightened. "There's been an administrative update." I asked her when the update happened. She said, "Recently." I asked if I had been notified. She said, "Notification was sent to all registered homeowners." I had received no such notification. I told her that. She said, "Perhaps it went to your spam folder." She said this with the slight, weightless shrug of someone who has learned to make gaslighting sound like helpfulness. The people around the pool watched. Still no one said anything. I knelt down next to Mama and took her hand. It was trembling, not from the heat. She whispered, "I didn't want to cause trouble, baby. I was just sitting. I wasn't even in the water yet." And that right there broke something in me. My 74-year-old mother, who had done everything right, followed every rule, carried the right paperwork, and walked 2 blocks in the summer heat to sit by a pool in a neighborhood where her daughter owned a home, was sitting there trembling because she didn't want to cause trouble. I stood up. I looked at Sandra and I said, calmly, clearly, with every ounce of professional self-control I have developed over 2 decades of emergency nursing, "My mother has a valid pool pass. I am a homeowner in good standing. We will be contacting the HOA board in writing by end of business Monday. If you continue to harass her, I will also be contacting an attorney." Sandra blinked. Then she said, "I'm just enforcing community standards." I took Mama's hand, and we walked home. That night I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad and I wrote down everything. Every date, every incident, every email, every taped notice, every oblique comment, going all the way back to the petunias in April. It was 9 pages by the time I finished. Mama sat across from me with her decaf coffee and didn't say much, just watched me write. And when I finally put the pen down, she said, "You're your father's child. My father was a union organizer." I took it as the compliment she meant it to be. Sunday morning I called Marcus. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he was already awake and already worried. Marcus has always had a sixth sense for family trouble, even from a distance. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Renee, record everything from now on. Video if you can. She's going to escalate." I asked him how he knew. He said, "Because you pushed back and people like her don't know how to handle that. They only know how to double down. Marcus is the youngest of the 4 of us, and the one I talk to most. He served in the Navy for 12 years. I won't say what he did because he never talks about it and I respect that. But I will say that he came home different from how he left, quieter and more deliberate. And in the years since his discharge, he'd built a career in private security consulting. He was based in Virginia Beach. He called Mama every Sunday without fail. He was the one who had sent her the swimming cap, 2 sizes, because he wasn't sure which would fit. Monday morning, I sent a formal written complaint to the HOA board, not just Sandra, but all 5 listed board members, whose contact information I had obtained from the County Property Records Office. I detailed the pool incident, the history of targeted enforcement, the absence of any written rule supporting Sandra's claimed administrative update, and cited the Fair Housing Act by name. I requested a formal response within 5 business days. I CC'd my personal email and printed 2 copies. Sandra's response came in less than 4 hours. It was not from the HOA board. It was a personal email from Sandra alone, written in the measured tone of someone who has spent time choosing every word for maximum plausibility. She expressed that she was concerned about my characterization of events, assured me she had only ever acted in accordance with HOA guidelines, and suggested that a follow-up conversation might clear up any misunderstanding. There was no mention of my Fair Housing Act reference. There was no mention of my request for a board response. I forwarded her email to the other 4 board members with a single line. Please note that the HOA president has responded to a formal complaint through personal email rather than through official board channels. I am still awaiting the official response I requested. Within the hour, I received a reply from a board member named Gerald Okafor, a name I didn't recognize, who wrote, simply, Ms. Williams-Carter, I was not aware of this incident. I will be reaching out to you directly. That email from Gerald would turn out to be the first crack in Sandra Pruitt's armor. That week, Mama stayed home from the pool. She didn't complain about it. She watered my plants, watched her shows, made her cornbread. But I noticed she'd stopped sitting on the front porch in the evenings the way she had been doing all summer. She said the mosquitoes were bad. I didn't push it, but I knew. And knowing made me angrier than anything Sandra had said directly to me. Gerald Okafor turned out to be a retired school principal who'd moved into Maplewood Ridge 2 years ago and joined the HOA board because, as he told me on the phone that Tuesday, I thought I could be useful. He was 68 years old, methodical and precise in his speech, and when I finished telling him everything, every incident in chronological order, he was quiet for a beat and then said, I need to look at the meeting minutes from the last 18 months. That was all. But the way he said it told me he already suspected something. Gerald called back Thursday. He had reviewed the minutes. The administrative update Sandra claimed had separated pool access from fitness center access. It was not in any meeting minutes. It had never been voted on. It had never been discussed at any official board meeting. It did not exist. Sandra had invented a rule and enforced it as fact against my 74-year-old mother in front of a pool full of witnesses. Gerald said, carefully, This is a significant problem. I said, Yes, it is. I asked Gerald if he planned to raise it with the full board. He said he would at the next scheduled meeting, which was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks felt like forever. I asked if there was any mechanism for an emergency session. He said he would look into it. I thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen. 3 weeks. Sandra had 3 weeks to do whatever Sandra was going to do next. And Marcus was right. She was going to do something. She didn't wait 3 weeks. The following Monday, I came home from a 12-hour shift to find a formal HOA citation on my door. Not taped this time. Hand-delivered in a sealed envelope with my name typed on the front. The citation was for unauthorized occupant in violation of HOA occupancy guidelines, which, per the citation, limited long-term guests to 30 days without formal board approval. Mama had been with me for 41 days. By Sandra's calculation, she had been an unauthorized occupant for 11 days. I sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. I needed to not walk in angry. Mama had made dinner. I could smell it from the driveway, and she was going to ask me how my day was, and I was going to have to decide in that moment how much to tell her. I decided to tell her everything. She deserved to know. She listened with her hands folded on the table, and when I finished she said, So she's trying to put me out. Not a question. A statement. Calm as still water. I told Mama she wasn't going anywhere. I told her I had already looked up the HOA's occupancy guidelines, the actual written ones, and there was no 30-day limit on guests. There was a line about extended stay guests requiring board notification, which I had done in writing on the day of her arrival. Sandra had cited a rule that, again, did not exist as written or had been fabricated to sound like it existed. Mama nodded slowly and said, She's not used to people knowing the rules better than she does. I said, No, she's not. I responded to the citation in writing the next morning, point by point, citing the actual text of the HOA guidelines and attaching my original guest registration submission with its timestamp. I also attached Sandra's original email acknowledging receipt of that submission. I sent it to all 5 board members, including Sandra, and to the property management company that handled HOA administrative services, a company called Greenway Residential, whose contact information I'd found in the fine print of my closing documents and never had occasion to use until now. Greenway Residential's community liaison, a woman named Bette Holloway, called me the very next day. She was professional, efficient, and when I explained the situation, she said, in a tone that suggested this was not entirely unfamiliar territory, "We appreciate you bringing this to our attention directly." She asked if I could send her the full documentation chain. I sent her 47 pages. She thanked me and said someone would be in touch. Sandra's next move came that Friday, and it was clever. I'll give her that. She organized what she called an impromptu community safety walkthrough, which she announced via the HOA email list as a way for residents to flag code concerns in the neighborhood. She and 2 of her board allies walked Birchwood Lane that Saturday morning, clipboards in hand. They photographed my fence line, my car parked in the driveway, and, I found out later from Patty, spent about 6 minutes standing in front of my house discussing the condition of my hydrangeas. I watched from inside through the front window. I did not go out. I did not engage. I recorded it on my phone through the glass. Sandra never looked directly at my window, but she paused in front of my house long enough that I knew she knew I was watching. She smiled at something one of her companions said and wrote something on her clipboard. She was building a file on me the same way I was building one on her. The difference was that hers was manufactured, and mine was real. 3 more citations arrived over the following 2 weeks. One for the condition of my hydrangeas, cited as landscaping noncompliance despite the fact that hydrangeas bloom in stages and the ones in front were simply in their between bloom period. Not dead, not neglected, just seasonal. One for a trash can that had been left at the curb until 9 p.m. on collection day instead of the specified 7 p.m. I had been in surgery prep at that hour, 12 hours into a shift. And one for a crack in my driveway that, per the citation, was a structural hazard. A hairline crack that had been there when I bought the house and was documented in my inspection report. I contested each citation individually with documentation, in writing, within the required response window. Gerald was copying me on internal board communications by this point, quietly without Sandra's knowledge, and from those I could see that Sandra was presenting these citations at informal check-ins, with her 2 board allies as evidence of a pattern of noncompliance on my part. She was constructing a narrative. I was a problem homeowner. My mother was an unauthorized occupant. My house was deteriorating. She was just enforcing standards. Marcus called me that Sunday and I read him the internal email chain Gerald had shared. He was quiet the whole time. When I finished, he said, "Renee, she's building a case for something bigger. She's not just annoying you. She's laying groundwork." I asked him what he thought the endgame was. He said, "HOA can't force you to sell, but they can fine you into financial stress, make your life miserable enough that you consider it, and meanwhile make the neighborhood feel hostile enough that you want to leave. It's a playbook. It's old. It works on people who don't know they're in it." I told him I knew I was in it. He said, "Good. Then don't flinch. I want to be honest about something. There were days during the stretch, late nights after long shifts, sitting in the driveway before going inside because I needed a minute alone, where I wondered if maybe it wasn't worth it. Not the fight itself, but the cost of it. The constant vigilance, the paper trail, the sense of being watched from across the street, the low-grade dread of checking my front door. I bought this house to rest in it. I was not resting. But then I'd walk inside and Mama would be in the kitchen or the living room or the backyard, going about the business of living, singing to herself, watching her shows, calling her church friends, and I'd remember that she was there because I had made a home she could come to. And this woman, this Sandra Pruitt, had made my mother shake at the edge of a pool. And that recalibrated everything. In the third week of July, something shifted in the internal board dynamics that Gerald told me about carefully and in general terms. Two of Sandra's board allies were starting to ask questions. Not about me specifically, but about process, why certain citations were being issued without full board discussion, why the pool rules Sandra had cited had no paper trail, whether the HOA was exposed to any legal liability. Sandra had apparently dismissed these questions at a check-in meeting as hypothetical concerns. But Gerald said she was rattled enough that she'd called him separately to ask whether he was sharing board communications externally. He had told her he was not. Technically, he was sharing them with a homeowner who had a complaint pending. He considered that different. Bette Holloway from Greenway Residential called me again in late July. She'd reviewed the 47 pages. She had additional questions specifically about the pool incident, the date, the time, the witnesses present. I gave her everything I had, including the name of one witness I'd tracked down. A woman named Cassie Marsh who'd been at the pool that Saturday with her 2 kids and had watched the whole thing and given me her card afterward, saying, "If you ever need someone to say what happened, I saw it." I gave Cassie a heads up before giving Bette her name. Cassie said, "Absolutely. Call her." August arrived, and with it Marcus, who had told me very casually 2 weeks prior that he was thinking about coming up for a visit. I didn't read too much into the timing. Marcus comes when Marcus is needed, and he had always had an instinct for when that was. He arrived on a Friday evening with a duffel bag and a box of Popeyes, and Mama met him at the door the way she always does, arms open, face lit up, calling him her baby even though he is 6'2" and built like the Navy made him, which it did. They sat up late that night in the kitchen, just the 2 of them. I could hear the murmur of their voices through the wall, Mama's laugh, the sound of Marcus making her laugh again, and I lay in bed listening and thought, this is what I bought this house for. Whatever Sandra Pruitt throws at us, this is what I bought this house for. Saturday morning, Marcus made breakfast, eggs, grits, toast, and we sat at the kitchen table and he went through my entire documentation file, methodically in silence, asking me questions only when he needed clarification. He asked about Gerald. He asked about Bette Holloway. He asked about the Fair Housing Act complaint. I had filed a formal complaint with HUD in early July, which I hadn't told him about yet, partly because I was still waiting to hear something substantive back. He looked up from the file when I said that. "You filed with HUD?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. That was exactly right. That Saturday afternoon was the first time Marcus and Sandra Pruitt were in the same space. He and Mama walked to the community pool together. I was working, and I'd added Marcus to my guest list properly with his ID copy and the form well within the required lead time. They were at the pool for about 40 minutes before Sandra appeared. Marcus told me about it later with the precise, detail-by-detail recounting of someone trained to report accurately. Sandra had arrived, seen Mama, and begun walking toward them with her clipboard before she apparently registered Marcus's presence. She had then stopped, mid-step, and changed direction. "She looked at me," Marcus said, "and then she looked away fast, like she was recalculating." He said it without drama, just a neutral observation. I asked what he thought she was recalculating. He was quiet for a second. Then, "She's used to people who won't fight back. She's trying to figure out if I'm one of those people." I asked what he thought she concluded. He said, "I think she decided to wait and see." He was right. And what she decided to do while she waited was the thing that finally ended it, but not before it got much, much worse. That evening, Patty came over and sat on my back porch with me while Marcus and Mama played cards inside. Patty had been one of the people at the pool the day of the original incident. She'd seen it, hadn't said anything, and had told me afterward, apologetically, that she'd been afraid to intervene. She still felt bad about it. She came over, I think, as a form of amends. She brought wine and information, which is the best combination possible. Patty told me she'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine, a text chain she was on with several other Birchwood Lane residents, that Sandra had been asking around about me, specifically, who I was, where I'd come from, whether I had any history in the neighborhood. She had apparently told at least one neighbor that she had concerns about my commitment to community standards, and that the HOA might need to take action if things didn't improve. Patty said, "She's talking about you like you're a nuisance tenant. You own your home, Renee. I wanted you to know what she's saying." I thanked Patty, and I added it to the file. The following week, Sandra made her first public move beyond the citations. She sent an email to the entire HOA listserv, 212 homeowners, announcing that the board would be holding a special community meeting to address what she called a pattern of escalating HOA violations at a property on Birchwood Lane. She did not name me by address. She didn't have to. Everyone on Birchwood Lane knew which house she meant. I read that email 11 times. Each time, something in my chest tightened. Not from fear, from a specific kind of cold clarity that I recognize from the worst nights in the ER, when you're the only person in the room who can see exactly how bad something is about to get and you have to keep your hands steady anyway. Sandra was taking this public. She was inviting the community to weigh in. She was turning 212 neighbors into an audience for my humiliation, or so she thought. I forwarded the email to Bet Holloway within the hour, with the subject line, "Community email from HOA President Ree. Active complaint." I also forwarded it to Gerald, to my attorney. I had quietly retained one the previous week, a woman named Patricia Lowe who specialized in fair housing and HOA disputes and who, when I described the situation, had said, "Oh, I know this pattern," with the weary certainty of someone who'd seen it 40 times, and to the HUD investigator assigned to my complaint, whose name was Raymond Cruz. Raymond Cruz had contacted me in late July for a preliminary interview. He was thorough, unhurried, and asked questions that told me he had already done background research before calling me. At one point he asked, "Has the HOA president made any statements in your presence that you interpreted as racially motivated?" I told him not explicitly. Sandra was too careful for that, but I described the pattern, who was targeted, who wasn't, the history Patty had described of black families leaving the street, the former board member Gloria Tate. He took notes. He asked about Gloria specifically. I gave him her contact information. The special community meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, 2 weeks out. Sandra titled it, in the calendar invite she sent to the listserv, "Community Standards and HOA Compliance, a Discussion." I decided, after talking to Patricia Lowe, to attend. Patricia's advice was specific. Sit near the front, say nothing unless directly addressed, take notes, and let Sandra make her case. People like her, Patricia said, always go further than they should when they think they're winning. Let her go further. It'll matter later. In the 10 days before the meeting, something interesting happened in the neighborhood. 3 different homeowners, people I barely knew, people I recognized from the mailbox or the sidewalk but had never spoken with directly, reached out to me. 2 sent emails found through the HOA directory. 1, a man named Tom Hendricks from the next block, actually knocked on my door. All 3 said some version of the same thing. They had also received citations from Sandra in the past year, had also felt that the enforcement was arbitrary, and they wanted to know if there was anything they could do to help. Tom Hendricks was a white man in his 60s, retired engineer, had lived in Maplewood Ridge for 14 years. He sat at my kitchen table for an hour and showed me the citations he'd received. 17 of them over 18 months. His crime? He had put a basketball hoop in his driveway without applying for an architectural review. His grandson visited on weekends. He had applied for the review twice and been denied both times without explanation. He'd assumed it was just bureaucratic nonsense. Talking to me, looking at my file, he said, "This is a pattern, isn't it?" I said, "Yes." The two women who emailed, Marisol Diaz-Fuentes and Linda Park, had similar stories. Marisol had been cited for a wind chime she'd inherited from her grandmother. Linda had been cited for a garden ornament she'd had for 6 years without incident, until Sandra joined the board. Both had paid their fines and said nothing. Both told me they'd been watching what was happening to me and felt, as Linda put it, like someone was finally saying out loud what we'd all been quietly experiencing. I asked if they'd be willing to document their experiences in writing. Both said yes immediately. I was building something now, not just a complaint, but a record wide enough to show a pattern that no one could dismiss as personal grievance. Tom, Marisol, Linda, Patty, Gloria Tate, Cassie Marsh, Gerald's internal communications, Bet Holloway's investigation, Raymond Cruz's HUD inquiry. I was not alone in this anymore. Sandra didn't know that yet. The Thursday of the community meeting came. I wore my good navy blazer. I got there early enough to take a seat in the second row, slightly to the right of center, so I had a clear sight line to Sandra and the board table. The room filled up. More people than I expected, maybe 60 or 70 homeowners, which was a larger turnout than the regular meetings. I recognized Tom Hendricks near the back. I recognized Marisol in the third row. Linda was 2 seats to my left. Patty sat beside me without a word and handed me a pen. Sandra opened the meeting with the gavel, 3 strikes, perfectly timed, very presidential, and launched into what I can only describe as a prepared performance. She spoke for nearly 12 minutes about community standards, the integrity of the HOA covenant, and the importance of consistent enforcement. She referenced anonymous violations without naming names. She quoted sections of the HOA guidelines with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed extensively. She never once looked directly at me. She looked at everyone else in the room. I took notes in my small spiral notebook. I wrote down her exact phrases. I noted the timestamps. I kept my face neutral. Beside me, Patty was doing the same thing on her phone, recording, I noticed, and I appreciated that without acknowledging it. Across the room, Tom Hendricks had his arms crossed and a particular look on his face that reminded me of the look nurses get when a patient's family member is saying something demonstrably untrue and everyone in the room knows it. When Sandra opened the floor for questions, the first hand up was a woman I didn't recognize. Older, in a cardigan, sharp eyes. She asked, pleasantly, whether the administrative update to the pool access policy that Sandra had referenced at a recent incident had been formally voted on by the board. The room got very quiet. Sandra said the update had been handled administratively, without requiring a formal vote. The woman in the cardigan said, according to our CC and RS, policy changes affecting amenity access require a full board vote. Could you point me to the record of that vote? Sandra said she would have to check the minutes. The woman in the cardigan turned out to be a retired paralegal named Harriet Bloom who had lived in Maplewood Ridge for 22 years, and, as I learned later, had been waiting for an opportunity exactly like this one for approximately 18 months. She had printed the CC and RS and brought them to the meeting in a binder. A binder. I almost smiled. 3 more residents asked questions. Pointed, specific, document referencing questions. Before Sandra managed to shut down the Q&A by announcing that the board would address specific inquiries in writing, she called for a motion to adjourn. Her 2 allies moved and seconded in under 4 seconds. Gerald abstained. The gavel came down. Sandra gathered her papers, and I watched her walk toward the exit with the tight-shouldered posture of someone who has just realized, for the first time, that the room is not entirely on her side. She stopped when she was level with my row and looked at me directly for the first time all evening. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it, or she found something she wasn't expecting because she looked away first and kept walking. I closed my notebook. Patty exhaled beside me. In the parking lot afterward, Harriet Bloom introduced herself, shook my hand firmly, and said, "I'll be at the next meeting. I'll bring more binders." I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not victory, it was much too early for that, but something like traction, like the ground was starting to hold. Mama was waiting up when I got home, sitting in the living room with the TV on low. "How'd it go?" she asked. I sat down next to her and said, "She's not as untouchable as she thinks she is." Mama patted my hand. "Never is," she said. "Never is." Marcus had stayed home that evening. His choice, which I'd respected. He sat across from us now and asked me to debrief him, which I did in detail. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, that particular stillness that I have always associated with him paying maximum attention. When I finished, he said, "She's going to escalate. The meeting didn't go the way she planned. She needs to reassert control. Watch what she does in the next 72 hours. I said, "I know." He said, "I know you know. I'm just saying it out loud so we can both be ready." Sandra's 72-hour response was not what I expected. I had anticipated another citation, another email, another bureaucratic maneuver. What I got 2 days after the meeting was a hand-delivered letter, formal HOA letterhead, signed by Sandra as president, notifying me that the HOA board had voted, at an emergency executive session, to begin the process of placing a lien on my property for outstanding HOA fines totaling $1,840. The citations, all those manufactured citations. Sandra had been calculating, collecting, and now she was trying to weaponize them. I called Patricia Lowe immediately. She was not surprised. She said liens were a common escalation tactic and that we could contest every single underlying citation, which we already had the documentation to do, and that a lien placed based on citations that had been formally contested and never adjudicated was on shaky legal ground. She also said, "An HOA calling an emergency executive session without proper notice to all board members is a procedural problem." I asked if Gerald had been notified of this session. I already knew the answer. Gerald had not been notified. He called me that same afternoon, clearly agitated. Gerald was not easily agitated, which made it notable. He had learned about the session from the formal lien letter that had been carbon copied to all board members after the fact. He had not been invited to participate. He said, "A 3-person executive session without quorum notification to take action with financial and legal implications. That is not how this board is supposed to operate." He was going to file a formal objection. I told him I was grateful. He said quietly, "This is wrong. It was wrong from the beginning." Patricia submitted our formal objection to the lien within 48 hours, citing the defective citation process, the procedural violations in the executive session, and the pattern of discriminatory enforcement. She copied Greenway Residential and HUD. Bet Holloway responded within a day. Greenway was pausing any lien processing pending their own internal review. Sandra would have known this the same day. I imagined her reading that email and tried to read the shape of what came next. What came next was something I did not anticipate and still find hard to describe without anger getting in the way of accuracy. On a Sunday morning, a Sunday, when Marcus was supposed to be driving back to Virginia Beach, I found my car, the 2021 Honda I'd paid off in March, with all 4 tires flat. Not from nails, from valve stems. Someone had manually deflated every tire by pressing the valve stems. It had happened overnight in my own driveway. I stood in the driveway in my scrubs. I had an early shift, and looked at my car and then at my phone and then back at my car. Marcus came out the front door behind me, took one look, and said, "Don't touch anything." Call the police first, then your insurance. He was already taking photographs. He was calm in the way that trained people are calm in situations that would make anyone else lose composure, which is to say he was not calm inside, but his hands were steady and his eyes were methodical, and he walked the perimeter of the driveway like he was clearing a room. I called the non-emergency line. An officer named Flores came within 40 minutes. He took our statements, photographed the tires, and noted that there was no visible damage to the valve stems beyond physical tampering. He said it was vandalism, Class B misdemeanor, and that without a witness or footage there wasn't much to go on immediately, but he would file the report and we'd have the report number for insurance and any follow-up investigation. He asked if we had any idea who might have done it. I said I had an idea. He said I could include that in my statement. I said Sandra Pruitt's name in my official statement to Officer Flores. I said it clearly with context, the ongoing HOA dispute, the lien threat, the timing, and I noted that I had no direct evidence linking her to the vandalism, but that I wanted the name documented in the event of future incidents. Flores nodded and wrote it down without expression. Marcus, standing beside me, said nothing. He had that look on his face that I'd seen once or twice before, a contained, precise attention that I think is what happens when his training kicks in and his instincts take over from his feelings. We arranged for a lift to get me to the hospital. Marcus stayed home with Mama, which I was grateful for. I didn't want her alone in the house that day, didn't want her to see the tires and spiral into fear about her safety. He had the car towed and the tires reinflated at a shop by early afternoon. The total cost was $180. I saved the receipt. I added it to the file. Patty texted me at noon. I heard about your car. I'm so sorry. Also, my security camera faces the street. Do you want me to check the footage? I sent back a single emoji, a prayer hands, and called her on my break. Her camera, a Ring doorbell mounted at an angle, covered most of the sidewalk in front of both our houses and the edge of my driveway. She and Marcus reviewed the footage together that afternoon. The footage showed, at 2:14 a.m., a figure in dark clothing and a baseball cap walking quickly up my driveway, stopping at each tire in turn, then leaving. The footage was grainy. The face was not clearly visible. But the figure's build, height, and distinctive gait, one hip slightly favored, right side, were on record. Marcus sent me a single text after reviewing the footage. I know what I know. Let the professionals handle it. I understood what that meant. He had seen something in that footage. He was choosing not to act on it himself. He was choosing to trust the process because he believed in it, or because he knew that the moment he stopped trusting the process and acted on instinct, everything we'd built would be compromised. That kind of restraint from someone with his background is not small. I know what it costs. I gave the footage to Officer Flores the next morning. He said he'd forward it to the detective who handles property crime cases. He also said, gently, "You should know that even if we identify the person from this footage, proving intent and connection to a civil dispute is complicated." I said I understood. I gave him a copy anyway. Copies of everything, always. That was the rule now. Patricia Lowe called me that Wednesday with an update I hadn't expected. A local fair housing nonprofit, the Metropolitan Fair Housing Alliance, had reached out to her office after seeing a social media post from Cassie Marsh, who had written publicly about what she'd witnessed at the pool that June Saturday. Cassie had not named me by name but had described the incident in enough detail that the Alliance had made inquiries. They wanted to know if I was working with counsel. Patricia said she'd told them yes. She asked if I was comfortable with the Alliance being aware of the situation. I said yes. The circle was widening. I was exhausted. I want to be honest about that. I was working 12-hour nursing shifts 3 or 4 times a week, fielding calls from Patricia and Gerald and Bet and Raymond Cruz, maintaining the documentation file, keeping Mama calm, keeping myself calm, sleeping in 4 to 6 hour stretches and waking up with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system has been on low-level alert for months. I was holding it together. But I was holding it together the way you hold a split seam, carefully with both hands, knowing one wrong move and the whole thing comes apart. Marcus extended his visit. He didn't announce it, just stopped talking about leaving. He started cooking dinner most nights, took Mama to her doctor's appointment, drove me to the grocery store when my car was in the shop. He was quiet about it, the way he is quiet about most things that matter to him. One night I said, "You don't have to stay." And he said, "I know," and kept reading. He had a paperback, something thick and dense, and he read the same way he did everything, completely without distraction. He never told me what the book was. I never asked. 2 weeks after the tire incident, Sandra made her next move, and this one was different from anything before it. She called a formal HOA board meeting. Properly noticed this time, all 5 members including Gerald, and placed on the agenda a motion to formally recommend to Greenway Residential that I be placed on what she called a remediation watch, a designation that, per a new policy document she distributed at the meeting, would require monthly inspection of my property and could, after 6 months of continued violations, trigger a referral to the county for code enforcement review. Gerald told me about the agenda item the morning of the meeting. He also told me he had been doing research of his own. He had pulled the HOA's original articles of incorporation and the CC&RS, the full document, not the excerpted version Sandra typically distributed, and had found something significant. The HOA board had the authority to establish policies, but not to create new enforcement mechanisms without a homeowner vote. The remediation watch program Sandra was proposing was a new enforcement mechanism. It required homeowner approval. Sandra either didn't know this or was betting no one would push back. Gerald was going to push back. The board meeting was a closed session. Board members only, no public. But Gerald gave me a verbatim account afterward by phone, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who wants to get the record exactly right. Sandra had presented her remediation watch motion with supporting materials, a packet she'd apparently prepared over several days, referencing my citation history, the disruption caused by my complaint filings, and what she called a general pattern of adversarial engagement with the community. Gerald had asked, point by point, whether each cited violation had been properly adjudicated. Sandra said the citations spoke for themselves. Gerald said procedural legitimacy was not optional. Her 2 allies voted yes.
Gerald voted no.
The remaining board member, a quiet man named Phil Garrett who had said almost nothing at any meeting I was aware of, abstained. Motion passed 3-1. Gerald also told me something else from that meeting, something he said quietly, carefully, as though he was aware that sharing it might be a line he was crossing and had decided to cross it anyway. During the discussion before the vote, Sandra had said, and Gerald quoted this exactly, "Some people aren't suited to HOA community living and refuse to understand that. Not everyone belongs in every neighborhood." Nobody at the table had challenged the statement. Gerald had written it down word for word in his personal notes. He read it to me over the phone, slowly, and then waited. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Gerald, I need you to write that down as a formal statement, sign it, and send it to me in writing." He said, "I already have. I'm emailing it now." He had anticipated my request. He had written his account before he called me. He had understood what that sentence meant, what it documented, and why it needed to be preserved with a signature attached. I received his email 7 minutes later. I forwarded it immediately to Patricia Lowe, to Raymond Cruz at HUD, and to Bette Holloway at Greenway. Raymond Cruz called me the next morning. He had received the email. He said, in his careful way, "This changes the scope of the investigation somewhat." I asked what that meant in practical terms. He said he couldn't discuss specifics of an open investigation, but he asked me to remain available for a follow-up interview within the next 2 weeks. He also asked, and this was new, whether I would be willing to provide a list of other residents who had experienced what I believed was inequitable enforcement. I gave him Tom Hendricks, Marisol Diaz-Fuentes, Linda Park, Harriet Bloom, and Patty. I also gave him Gloria Tate's number again, in case he hadn't already connected with her. That Friday, I received a letter from Greenway Residential Formal, on letterhead, notifying me that they had suspended the Remediation Watch designation pending the outcome of their internal review, that the lien had been put on hold pending the resolution of my contested citations, and that they were in the process of retaining outside counsel to advise them on their legal exposure in the matter. They used the phrase legal exposure. My attorney called it the moment a management company realizes they could get named in a lawsuit. She said it not with glee but with the calm satisfaction of someone who has been building toward exactly this outcome for months. Sandra sent an email to the full HOA listserv the same day, 212 residents, announcing that the Remediation Watch designation had been temporarily paused due to administrative review, framing it as a procedural step she had initiated, as if it were her idea. She included a paragraph about her commitment to fair and consistent enforcement and her ongoing work to improve community systems. I read it twice and then set my phone face down on the kitchen table and breathed for 60 seconds. Then I called Patricia and we talked strategy for the next phase, which was the formal HOA board election scheduled for September, just 6 weeks away. The board election. I had not seriously considered running for the board until Patricia raised it as a possibility in late July. It had seemed too aggressive, too confrontational, too much to take on alongside everything else. But by August, after 6 months of citations and the tire incident and the lien threat and Gerald's statement and the HUD investigation and the management company's growing alarm, Patricia's argument had become more persuasive. The fastest path to structural change in an HOA is to change the board. Gerald was already on the board and already an ally. If one more ally replaced one of Sandra's allies, the dynamic shifted. The motion for Remediation Watch had passed 3-1. We needed to flip one vote. I told Marcus. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You sure?" I said, "No, but I'm doing it anyway." He smiled, a small private smile, and said, "Okay, what do you need?" I said I needed him to not immediately start planning everything the way he plans everything, and to just let me tell him about it first. He said, "Fair enough." We sat at the kitchen table and I told him what I was thinking. I wasn't going to run against Sandra. She wasn't up for re-election this cycle. But one of her allies, a woman named Donna Weeks, was, and the seat she occupied was the one I was going to contest. I filed my candidacy with Greenway Residential on a Tuesday, the last day before the deadline, which I had checked 3 times to confirm. Greenway acknowledged receipt. Sandra found out 2 days later, apparently through the candidate list that Greenway distributed to all board members. Gerald told me her reaction had been, in his words, notably controlled, which he interpreted, and I agreed, as she had known this was possible and had already thought about how to respond. Sandra Pruitt did not do anything she hadn't prepared for. She prepared for everything. That was both her strength and, as I was starting to understand, the thing that would eventually make her predictable. The campaign period for the HOA board election was 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which candidates could post flyers, attend community events, and be presented to homeowners in a candidate forum that Greenway Residential organized and moderated to keep it neutral. Sandra could not formally campaign for her ally Donna, but she was not required to be neutral either, and she made sure everyone in the neighborhood understood, through conversations and comments and the particular social capital she'd spent years accumulating, that Donna Weeks was the choice of community stability. I started knocking on doors. Door knocking in Maplewood Ridge was something I had never done in my life, and it was humbling in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had spent years as a nurse, a person who enters other people's worst moments with competence and calm, but standing on someone's front porch in my neighborhood, asking for their vote, felt genuinely vulnerable. I had a one-page sheet with my background, my concerns about HOA governance, and 3 concrete things I'd do if elected. Transparent meeting minutes published. Within a week of every session, a formal citation review process, and an anonymous reporting channel for homeowners who felt enforcement had been unfair. Most people were polite. A few were enthusiastic. One older man on the far side of the neighborhood opened his door, listened to me for 30 seconds, said, "You're the one fighting Sandra Pruitt, aren't you?" and shook my hand before I'd said another word. 3 people told me they'd heard about the pool incident. Word had spread further than I'd realized, and at least 2 of them said they were glad someone was doing something. One woman, a newcomer who'd moved in just 3 months ago, said, "I haven't been here long enough to know all the politics, but you seem like a reasonable person and I'll vote for whoever isn't manufacturing drama." I took that as a yes. Sandra's campaign for Donna was sophisticated in the way that all of Sandra's operations were sophisticated. Plausibly deniable, always just within the lines. A flyer appeared on mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, not from Sandra's name, but from Concerned Residents for Community Standards, listing Donna's accomplishments as a board member and including, in the last paragraph, a vague reference to candidates who have demonstrated a pattern of adversarial behavior toward our community. No names, no specifics, just the suggestion hung in the air that one candidate was a problem. I added the flyer to my file. Tom Hendricks called me after seeing the flyer and offered to write a counterstatement to go out on the neighborhood email list. I thanked him and said I appreciated it, but that I didn't want to get into a flyer war. I wanted my candidacy to speak for itself. He understood, but he told me he was writing to the list anyway, independently, to share his own experience with selective citation enforcement. He did. The email was polite, factual, and devastating in a low-key way. 12 people replied to the list in agreement. 2 people replied defending Sandra. The ratio was notable. Harriet Bloom organized an informal gathering at her house. A meet-the-candidate coffee that she framed as casual, not political, just neighborly. 14 people came. Harriet had, in fact, made coffee. We sat in her living room and I talked about what I'd experienced, what I'd learned about HOA procedures, and what I thought needed to change. The questions were pointed and thoughtful. Someone asked about the HUD complaint. I confirmed it existed and said I couldn't discuss specifics of an ongoing investigation. Someone else asked whether I thought the HOA had been operating legally. I said I had concerns that were being reviewed by the appropriate authorities, which was both accurate and carefully chosen. Marcus drove me to 3 of the door-knocking sessions. He didn't come to the doors with me. He waited in the car, reading his paperback. But he was there when I got back from each house, windows down, unhurried. On the 3rd session he said, after I'd gotten in the car, "You're good at this." I said, "I'm good at talking to people. That's different from being good at this." He said, "Maybe, but it's the part that matters." He started the car. We went home and Mama had made cobbler. 9 days before the election, Donna Weeks dropped out. It was announced quietly, with no explanation, through a brief note to Greenway Residential that was distributed to board members only. Gerald told me within the hour. She simply withdrew her candidacy. No statement, no public announcement, no reason given. The effect was that I was now running unopposed for her seat. I would win by default unless someone filed a last-minute candidate declaration, which the deadline did not permit. The next day, Sandra sent an email to the HOA listserv about the upcoming fall landscaping schedule. She did not mention the election. I did not publicly celebrate Donna's withdrawal. I sent a brief, Professional email to Greenway acknowledging that I would be proceeding as the sole candidate and asking to confirm the appointment process and first board meeting schedule. I got a reply within 2 hours. The first meeting of the new board would be in early October. Patricia called me that evening. I could hear something close to relief in her voice. She is a composed woman who does not telegraph emotion easily, but she said simply, "One step." I said, "One step." We moved on to next steps. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was why Donna had dropped out. That came out later in pieces from multiple directions. Donna, it turned out, had her own HOA compliance file that Sandra was holding over her. Minor things, nothing severe, but enough to create dependency. Their arrangement had always been transactional. Donna voted the way Sandra wanted. Sandra looked the other way on Donna's small infractions. When Greenway's outside counsel began making inquiries into the board's citation history, that arrangement became a liability for Donna specifically. She made a quiet calculation and stepped back. That was the first crack I hadn't seen coming. But here is the twist I really hadn't seen. Donna Weeks, in a conversation I only learned about months later, had spoken to Raymond Cruz at HUD. Voluntarily, she had reached out to him. She had told him things about the board's internal deliberations, specifically about the pool incident and its aftermath, that she had witnessed firsthand as a board member. She had not been willing to say any of it publicly, but she had said it to a federal investigator with documentation because she had apparently decided that some things were more important than her landscaping citations. I don't know what finally moved her to that decision. I'm glad she made it. The week before the new board term started, Marcus finally went back to Virginia Beach. He hugged Mama for a long time at the front door, then turned to me and said, "You've got this." I said I knew. He said, "Call me after the first meeting." I said I would. He drove away in his truck, and I stood on the front porch for a moment in the September morning and felt the particular quiet of a house that has just become less full. Then Mama appeared in the doorway behind me with her coffee and said, "Come eat something," and I went inside. The first board meeting of the new term was in early October, on a Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. in the community room. The room held 50. About 30 people showed up, unusually high attendance for a regular meeting, which told me word had spread. Sandra arrived in her blazer and pearls, gavel in hand. She looked at me when I sat down at the board table for the first time and said nothing. Her expression was the careful blankness of someone who has decided, strategically, that acknowledgement costs more than silence. I had spent the week before the meeting reviewing every piece of HOA procedure, every line of the CC and RS, every past meeting minute that Gerald had shared with me. I came prepared in the way that nurses come prepared for a difficult case, not with aggression but with information, fully stocked, ready for the unexpected. I had also talked to Patricia about what I could and couldn't say at the meeting given the active HUD investigation. The answer was, I could ask questions, raise procedural concerns, and vote. I could not discuss the complaint or the investigation publicly. That was fine. I had Gerald for backup and Harriet Bloom in the audience with her binder. The first substantive agenda item was Sandra's proposal for a new pool access policy, a formal written policy this time that she was presenting for a board vote. It was, I noted as I read it, nearly identical to the rule she had attempted to enforce against my mother in June without any such policy existing. She was retroactively legitimizing the thing she had already done. It required a vote. The vote was Sandra, her one remaining ally, myself, Gerald, and Phil Garrett, the abstainer who had said almost nothing for months. I spoke against the policy on 2 grounds. First, that the implementation of a new amenity access restriction required homeowner notification and a 30-day comment period per the CC and RS. Second, that introducing this specific policy while an active complaint and investigation related to its informal prior enforcement was ongoing created potential legal liability for the board. I said this calmly with citations in under 3 minutes. Sandra said the comment period was advisory, not mandatory. I said, Article 7, Section 4 disagrees. I had the page number. Sandra looked at the gavel and didn't pick it up. The vote was 2-2 with Phil Garrett abstaining again. Policy failed. It was the first time Sandra had lost a board vote in, according to Gerald, approximately 3 years. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone in the audience started to clap. Just one person, then a few others. Sandra let it fade, then moved to the next agenda item without comment. Her face showed nothing. Her hands were perfectly still on the table. But I noticed for the first time that she hadn't used the gavel since the procedural objection. After the meeting, Harriet Bloom shook my hand again and said, "You did exactly right." She had the look of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen and has now seen the beginning of it. Tom Hendricks texted me, 3 years. She hasn't lost a vote in 3 years. I read his text in the parking lot and let myself feel it for exactly 60 seconds. Then I got in my car and called Mama to tell her I'd be home soon. The weeks that followed the October board meeting were quieter than any stretch I'd had since April. No new citations appeared on my door. The lien remained suspended. The remediation watch designation had never formally materialized. The HUD investigation was ongoing but invisible. Sandra continued to chair board business with her characteristic efficiency, but something was different in her. More controlled, more measured, as if she was conserving resources, recalibrating. I recognized the posture. I use it myself when a patient's situation is unstable and I'm deciding my next move. Mama was doing well. She'd made friends, actual friends, with 2 women on the next block, one named Esther and one named Ruth, which she found biblically funny and mentioned often. They had coffee on Thursday mornings and went to a prayer group at Esther's church on Sunday evenings. Mama had stopped staying off the front porch. She sat out there in the October evenings with her decaf and her sweater, watching the leaves change, calling hello to neighbors as they passed. She was not afraid anymore. Or she had decided not to show it, which amounts to the same thing. I was sleeping better. Not perfectly. A nurse in her 40s never sleeps perfectly, but better. The documentation file on my laptop, which had grown to 112 pages, was organized, current, and backed up in 3 places, including an external drive that I kept at the hospital in my locker, because I am not taking chances with the evidence. Patricia Lowe called every 2 weeks or so with updates, which were mostly, "The investigation continues, Greenway's review continues, no news is not bad news." I kept going to work. I kept coming home. I kept being exactly where I was. In late October, I got a call from Gloria Tate, the former board member I'd found in the old meeting minutes, who had met me for coffee back in May. She had spoken with Raymond Cruz at HUD at length. She told me this with a particular directness, like someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally found the right place to set it down. She had told him everything she knew from her 6 years on the board, everything she'd seen, everything she'd been pressured to overlook, the reasons she'd ultimately resigned. She said, "I should have spoken up sooner. I know that." I said she was speaking up now and that mattered. Gloria also told me something that changed the way I understood the previous 6 months. She said Sandra had done this before, not exactly this, but the same pattern. Identify a homeowner who was different from the established community profile, find or manufacture a compliance issue, apply pressure, escalate when challenged, use board allies to legitimize the process. The families Patty had mentioned, the ones who'd left the neighborhood. Gloria knew who they were. She had seen it happen to them. She had not stopped it. She'd resigned instead, which she said she knew was not enough, and she'd been right. I asked Gloria if she'd be willing to share what she'd told HUD in a formal written statement. She said she already had, with Raymond's guidance. She'd also been in contact with the Metropolitan Fair Housing Alliance. The picture was becoming clearer, not just a personal grievance between me and a difficult HOA president, but a documented pattern of exclusionary enforcement over multiple years, multiple families. What had started at a pool on a June Saturday was a chapter in a longer story. That story was now being told by multiple narrators to multiple investigators. November came. The HOA held its regular monthly meeting, unremarkable, procedural, mostly landscaping and the holiday decoration guidelines. Sandra chaired it efficiently and adjourned it in 40 minutes. Nothing contentious was raised. Nothing contentious was resolved. I voted on 2 minor items, both passed unanimously, both entirely reasonable. We could have been any ordinary board in any ordinary neighborhood. I knew we were not. The holiday decoration guidelines were the thing I want to mention because they were, in their way, a small measure of justice in a very small register. The prior guidelines, which Sandra had drafted and enforced, prohibited lights outside of white and warm amber tones. They prohibited inflatable or oversized lawn ornaments entirely. They limited exterior decoration to a 45-day window. These were legal but restrictive, the kind of restrictions that sound neutral but have the effect of enforcing a particular aesthetic vision over everyone else's traditions and joy. At the November meeting, I moved to amend the decoration guidelines. Gerald seconded. Sandra voted against. Phil Garrett voted yes. Motion passed 3-2. Mama saw the change in the newsletter that Greenway published after the meeting. She read it at the kitchen table and looked up at me over her reading glasses and said, "You changed the Christmas lights." I said, "Among other things." She folded the newsletter and set it down and went back to her coffee. But she was smiling. It was a small thing. But small things, done consistently in the right direction, add up to something. I learned that from her. In the second week of December, Bette Holloway from Greenway Residential called me with an update that was no longer routine. She said their internal review had concluded. She said the findings were significant. She said the board would be receiving formal written notification from Greenway's legal team the following week, and that she was calling me as a courtesy, not as a party to anything official, but as a homeowner who had been directly affected and who deserved to know that the process had reached a consequential stage. She did not tell me what the findings were. She didn't have to. Her voice told me enough. The Greenway notification arrived, as promised, in the second week of December, delivered by certified mail to each board member. Sandra received hers. Gerald received his and called me within the hour to read me the key points. Greenway had determined that 7 citations issued to my property were procedurally defective and would be dismissed with no financial obligation on my part. The lien filing had been improper and would be formally withdrawn. The Remediation Watch program had been found to exceed the HOA board's authority without homeowner approval and was declared void. And Greenway was recommending that the board retain independent legal counsel to review its governance practices going forward. 7 citations dismissed. The lien voided. The Remediation Watch declared void. I sat at my kitchen table and read the list Gerald had given me. I'd made him read it twice, slowly, and I felt something release in my chest that had been held tight since April. Not everything. The HUD investigation was still open. Sandra was still on the board. But the manufactured structure she had built around me was officially, documentably, in writing, dismantled. I called Patricia. She said, "This is a good day. Let yourself have it." I did for a few hours. Then I went back to work. Sandra sent no response to the listserv about the Greenway findings. She sent no email to board members. She said nothing at the December board meeting, which was brief and formulaic, a holiday schedule, a reminder about snow removal responsibilities, a motion to defer the January landscaping discussion to February. She moved through the agenda like a machine, perfectly composed, and when it was over she gathered her materials and left without speaking to anyone. It was the first meeting she'd attended since October in which she had not used the gavel. Christmas came. Marcus drove up from Virginia Beach 2 days before, surprising Mama, who had genuinely not expected him until Christmas Eve. She made a sound when she opened the door that I don't have a word for, something between a cry and a laugh, and held him for a long time. I stood in the hallway and felt so full of something that I had to look at the ceiling for a second. Marcus had brought gifts, real, considered, specific gifts, one for each of us, and we spent the evening in the living room with the tree Mama and I had decorated the previous weekend, talking about nothing in particular, warm and unhurried. I thought about Sandra Pruitt that Christmas, briefly, and then set it aside. Not from charity. I am not there yet and I won't pretend otherwise, but because she didn't deserve to occupy that space. The holiday belonged to the people in my living room. It belonged to Mama laughing at something Marcus said. It belonged to the lights Mama and I had strung on the front porch in colors that, under the old guidelines, would have been non-compliant. It belonged to the home I had built and the people who filled it. In early January, Raymond Cruz called me for what he described as a follow-up interview, but which felt different from the previous ones. More structured, more focused, like he was closing something rather than continuing to gather. He asked me to confirm specific dates and events, asked whether I had documentation of certain items. I did, for everything. And at the end of the call said, "Ms. Williams Carter, I want to let you know that this investigation is in its final stages. You should expect to hear something formal from our office in the next 4 to 8 weeks." I thanked him. He said, "You kept excellent records. That made a significant difference." After that call, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for a few minutes before going in for my shift. I thought about March, when I'd gone to that first HOA meeting with the cheerful naivety of a new homeowner who wanted to be a good neighbor. I thought about June, kneeling by Mama's chair at the pool, holding her trembling hand. I thought about the 9-page legal pad, the 47 pages I'd sent to Bette Holloway, the 112 pages in the file on my laptop. I thought about Tom Hendricks at my kitchen table, and Harriet Bloom and her binder, and Gloria Tate finally saying what she'd seen. I thought, we built something real here. That was real. January passed. February was cold and slow and uneventful in the way of a season that is mostly about endurance. Mama was talking about going back to Gary when the weather broke. Her landlord had finally made the repairs. She missed her church. She missed Esther and Ruth, but also missed her other Esther and Ruth, the church ones, and I had complicated feelings about it that I kept mostly to myself. Having her go back felt like a loss. Watching her thrive enough to want to go back felt like a different thing. In February, the Fair Housing Alliance published a piece in their quarterly newsletter, not naming me by name, but describing a recent case in which an HOA president's pattern of selective enforcement had resulted in a federal investigation, a management company's internal review, and the dismissal of multiple improper citations. The case was described with enough specificity that anyone who knew the situation would recognize it. I read the piece twice. It used the word systematic. It used the phrase documented pattern. It was careful and accurate, and I was grateful for every word. Sandra read it too. I know because a resident who was on the neighborhood text chain told me Sandra had forwarded it to her board ally with the message, "This is a one-sided account. We should discuss." The board ally forwarded it to Gerald thinking she was forwarding it to someone else. Gerald forwarded it to me. Sandra's message told me 2 things. She knew the alliance piece was about Maplewood Ridge, and she still believed this was a narrative problem rather than an accountability problem. That distinction would cost her. In early March, nearly a full year after those petunias had been sighted on my front stoop, Raymond Cruz called me on a Thursday morning. I was at home, between shifts, drinking coffee. He said, "I have an update I'd like to share with you. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has completed its investigation into your complaint. I put my coffee down. He said, "We have found reasonable cause to believe that discriminatory practices were employed in the administration of HOA rules at Maplewood Ridge Estates." Reasonable cause. Those two words. I'd known they were possible. Hearing them said out loud was still something I hadn't quite prepared for. Raymond explained the next steps in measured, bureaucratic language that I won't fully reproduce here, because the specifics are ongoing. What I will say is this. HUD's finding created a pathway for formal enforcement action, for a conciliation process with the HOA and its management company, and for potential civil penalties. It did not resolve everything in a single phone call, but it validated, with the authority of a federal agency, that what I had experienced was real, documented, and illegal. Not just rude, not just difficult, illegal. I called Patricia immediately. She said, "I'm looking at the case file right now." I was expecting this call. She was already thinking about the conciliation phase, the potential for remedies, monetary, structural, and procedural, and what the alliance could bring to the table as a co-complainant. She was, as always, 3 steps ahead. I told her I needed 24 hours to just let it land before I started planning next moves. She said, "Take them." She was quiet for a second and then said, "You did this, Renee. You built this case." I said, "We built it." She said, "Yes, but you started it." I called Marcus. He picked up on the first ring. I said, "HUD found reasonable cause." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay." Just that. One word, but the weight behind it was a year of restraint and patience and watching his sister fight something he understood was real, letting the process work the way he believed it should work, trusting it even when it was slow and grinding and frustrating. That okay was not small. I knew what it had cost him to get there. I told Mama over dinner that evening. I was careful about how I framed it, not triumphant, just factual. I said, "The government found that what happened to you at the pool was part of a pattern of discrimination. They're going to take action." Mama put down her fork. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That woman made me feel like I didn't belong in your neighborhood. In my daughter's neighborhood." Another pause. "I belonged." I said, "You did. You do." She picked up her fork and continued eating. That was how Mama handled most things, with the dignity of continuing. The next 2 months were a blur of legal procedure that I'll compress here for the sake of coherence. HUD initiated conciliation proceedings. Greenway Residential agreed to participate immediately. The HOA board, technically Sandra's board, was required to respond through counsel. The outside counsel that Greenway had brought in to advise the board turned out to be, in the words of Patricia Lowe, very motivated to settle this quickly and cleanly before it gets any uglier. That motivation came from a number of directions simultaneously. Direction 1. The 7 dismissed citations, the voided lien, and the voided remediation watch program collectively represented a documented record of procedural misconduct that any plaintiff's attorney could use as exhibits. Direction 2. Gloria Tate's statement and Donna Weeks's voluntary HUD interview together described a pattern that predated my arrival in the neighborhood by several years. Direction 3. Gerald's signed statement. Some people aren't suited to HOA community living and refuse to understand that. Not everyone belongs in every neighborhood. Was in the hands of HUD investigators and, by extension, the conciliation process. That quote was never going to help Sandra in any forum. Sandra hired her own attorney, separate from the HOA's outside counsel. This was significant because it meant the HOA's counsel and Sandra's personal counsel had different, and potentially conflicting, interests. The HOA needed to settle to limit institutional liability. Sandra needed to protect herself personally. Those interests do not always align. Patty, who had been following everything closely, and had more neighborhood intelligence than anyone I knew, texted me in late April. Word is Sandra and the board are not on the same page anymore. I read that twice and thought, there it is, the second crack. I should say something here about what I was doing while all of this was happening in legal corridors I couldn't fully see. I was living my life. I was working my shifts. I was caring for patients, real people in real pain, which has a way of scaling everything else back to proportion. I was sitting on my porch in the spring evenings with Mama before she returned to Gary. I was keeping my documentation file current, attending board meetings, voting on reasonable things alongside Gerald and an increasingly independent Phil Garrett. I was being a neighbor. I was being a homeowner. I was being exactly where I'd always said I had the right to be. Mama went back to Gary in May. She had stayed 11 months, which was 10 months and 3 weeks longer than either of us had planned. The morning she left, she stood in the doorway of the guest room for a long time, not saying anything, just looking at it. And I thought about how she'd stood at the backyard window that very first morning and said, "Baby, you did real good." I thought about the pool. I thought about her hands trembling. I thought about her folding the HOA newsletter and smiling over her coffee. I said, "You can come back whenever you want. This is still your room." She said, "I know it is." She hugged me for a long time and got in the lift. I stood on the porch after the car turned the corner, just like I had the summer before when she'd walked to the pool. And then I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while by myself. The house was quiet. The hydrangeas were starting to come back in the front yard, exactly like they always did in May, because that's what hydrangeas do. I looked at them through the front window and thought about the citation for landscaping noncompliance, and thought about how much effort it takes to manufacture a problem that doesn't exist. And then I put on my shoes and went to work. In late May, Patricia called with news that the conciliation process had produced an initial offer from the HOA and Greenway. I will not share the specifics of the financial terms because they are confidential, but I will say the number was significant enough that Patricia said, flatly, "Don't take the first offer." I did not. The second offer came 2 weeks later. Patricia said, "This is more serious." I asked her recommendation. She gave it. I took 2 days to think. Then I said yes to the structure of the agreement, contingent on the non-financial terms, which were the things that actually mattered most to me. The non-financial terms I insisted on: 1. All 7 citations dismissed from my record permanently. 2. A formal written apology from the HOA board to my mother, Dorothy Mae Williams, signed by all 5 board members. 3. Mandatory fair housing training for all current and future HOA board members. 4. An independent review of all citations issued over the past 3 years for evidence of disparate impact. 5. The posting of a fair housing notice in the community room and on the HOA website, permanently. Sandra's attorney pushed back on items 2 and 4. I didn't move. After 10 days, they accepted all 5. The signed apology to Mama arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a sealed envelope. I read it before calling her. It was 2 paragraphs, formal and spare, but it used her full name, Dorothy Mae Williams, and it said that she had been wrongly denied access to the pool amenity and treated in a manner inconsistent with HOA policies and the law, and that the board regretted the incident. Every board member's signature was on it, including Sandra Pruitt's. I stared at Sandra's signature for a long time. Then I called Mama. Mama listened while I read her the apology, slowly, all the way through. She was quiet on the line for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Renee, honey, do you know what that woman saw when she looked at me at that pool?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "An old black woman who she thought wouldn't fight back." Another pause. "She forgot I raised you." I had to put my hand over my phone for a second so she wouldn't hear me cry. The signed settlement agreement was executed in June. exactly 1 year after Mama had walked 2 blocks to the pool in her swimming cap. Patricia called me after the final signatures were in to confirm completion. I said, "So it's done." She said, "The legal part is done. What happens next is up to the community." I thought about that. I thought about Tom Hendricks's basketball hoop, which was now fully installed and approved. I thought about Marisol's wind chime. I thought about the Christmas lights in all their non-compliant colors. I thought about Harriet Bloom and her binder. I thought, the community is already happening. What I had not yet fully accounted for was Sandra. The settlement did not require her resignation from the board. Patricia had considered whether to push for it, but the legal mechanism wasn't clean, and I had decided that winning the board seat and changing the board's behavior structurally was more important than a symbolic removal. Sandra was entitled to serve out her term. Sandra's term ended in November. What happened between June and November was the thing that ultimately decided Sandra Pruitt's fate in this community, and it was not anything I arranged. It started with the Independent Citation Review, Term 4 of my settlement agreement. Greenway retained an outside reviewer, a fair housing specialist from a firm in Philadelphia, who spent 6 weeks going through 3 years of citation records. The reviewer's report was delivered to the board in August. It was 43 pages. It found a statistically significant disparity in citation rates for homeowners of color compared to white homeowners in identical circumstances. Same types of landscaping, same types of decorative items, same types of occupancy patterns. The disparity was not explained by any legitimate enforcement rationale. The report used the word systemic. The citation review report was, per the settlement terms, to be made available to all homeowners upon request. Gerald posted a notice to the HOA listserv that the report was available. 68 homeowners requested it within the first week. A local journalist who covered suburban community affairs got a copy, how I never fully confirmed, but the document was technically not confidential under the settlement terms, and wrote a piece that ran online in late August. The headline, HOA in Maplewood Ridge cited for systemic fair housing violations. Review finds 3-year pattern. Sandra's name appeared in paragraph 4. I did not speak to that journalist. I had nothing to do with the article. Patricia had advised me to say nothing publicly about the settlement terms or the investigation, and I followed her advice. The article was built entirely from the review report, HUD's public-facing summary of its findings, and a statement from the Metropolitan Fair Housing Alliance. The journalist tried to reach Sandra for comment. She did not respond. Her attorney provided a one-line statement saying she disputes the characterizations in the report. The article ran anyway. The article was shared on a local community Facebook group, one of those suburban parent groups with a few thousand members, and the comments were something I made a deliberate choice not to read. Marcus texted me a screenshot of the top comment, which was from someone I didn't know. So she went after a nurse and her elderly mother and lost a federal investigation? In this economy? I sent Marcus back a laughing emoji and put my phone down. What happened at the August board meeting was something I hadn't fully prepared for, even though in retrospect I should have. The meeting room was at capacity, 60 people, standing room in the back, and it had the particular electric quality of a room where people have been holding a conversation in their cars and their kitchens and their text chains for weeks and are now finally in the same physical space. Sandra arrived and took her seat and called the meeting to order and used the gavel once. And the room was not the room it had been a year ago. The room had read the report. 4 residents spoke during public comment. All 4 were measured, specific, and devastating in the way that precision is always more devastating than heat. Tom Hendricks spoke about the basketball hoop. Marisol Diaz-Fuentes spoke about her grandmother's wind chime. A man I didn't know, a homeowner named James Lee who had received 18 citations in 2 years, more than anyone in the 3-year review, spoke about the financial cost of contesting citations on a fixed income. And Harriet Bloom, last, read 4 sentences from the settlement terms directly, including the line about the board's obligation to provide fair housing training. She looked at Sandra when she read that line. Sandra looked at the table. After public comment, Sandra attempted to move to old business. Phil Garrett interrupted her, quietly, without drama, and said he wanted to note, for the record, that he had reviewed the citation review report and found its conclusions troubling, and that he believed the board owed the community a fuller response than had been provided through counsel. Sandra said the board's legal team had advised against public comment on the report. Phil said he wasn't asking Sandra, he was making a statement for the record. Gerald seconded the statement. Sandra used the gavel. Nobody stopped talking. She lost control of the meeting for approximately 8 minutes. Not through chaos. Nobody shouted. Nobody moved toward anyone. Nobody did anything dramatic. But in the quiet, unstoppable way of a room that has decided collectively to speak and is not going to be gavelled into silence. Questions were asked. Sandra answered some, deflected others, said, "That's outside the scope of tonight's agenda for times." Phil Garrett answered 2 questions directly, without deferring to Sandra. Gerald answered 3. Sandra gavelled the meeting closed 10 minutes early. I drove home from that meeting thinking about the word, systemic. I thought about how long a thing has to persist before it becomes systemic. How many families, how many citations, how many exits. I thought about the families Patty had mentioned, the ones who'd left before me. I thought about Gloria Tate, who'd watched and resigned rather than stopped it. I thought about Mama at the pool. I thought about how close I had come to being one of those families. The ones who left, the ones who took the path of least resistance because the other path was so costly and so long. I thought about why I hadn't left. Part of it was the house itself. I loved the house, the blue shutters and the hydrangeas and the guest room with the window that faced the backyard. Part of it was principle, which I'm aware sounds abstract but which wasn't abstract to me. I had earned that house and no one was going to run me out of it. But a larger part of it was something Marcus had said early on. Don't flinch. Not as in don't feel it. I felt every bit of it, every taped citation and manufactured rule and trembling in my mother's hands. But don't let the flinch become a retreat. Don't let them mistake pain for defeat. In September, the HOA held its annual homeowner meeting, the big one, where board elections happen and the full community gathers and the year's budget is voted on. Sandra would be on the agenda in a formal capacity for the last time. Her term expired in November, and she was not seeking re-election. She had announced this in a brief email in late August, framed as a personal decision to step back and focus on family. No elaboration. No acknowledgement of the past year. Just the announcement, clipped and final, and then silence from her for several weeks. I want to be honest about what I felt when I read that email. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not relief. Something more complicated, a kind of recognition that the thing was ending, and also an awareness that it wasn't actually over, that the families who had left before me hadn't gotten this ending. That the apology letter to Mama was a piece of paper and not the full weight of what she had been made to feel. The legal process had worked. The community had shifted. Sandra was leaving the board. And I was still thinking about those families who had left before me and wondering if any of them knew. I wondered that out loud to Patricia one afternoon, and she said something that I've thought about a lot since. Part of what settlements can do, if they're structured right, is create a record that matters to people you'll never meet. The independent review, the fair housing training, the structural changes, those exist now. Someone else, sometime in the future, will benefit from what you built here without ever knowing your name. That's not nothing. I said no, it wasn't nothing. It wasn't everything either. She said, no, but it's what we had to work with. The September annual meeting was attended by 91 homeowners, the highest turnout in the recorded history of Maplewood Ridge, according to Greenway's records. Sandra chaired it with her characteristic precision. She did not acknowledge the past year. She did not address the article, the report, the settlement, the citation review, the HUD finding, or the apology letter. She went through the agenda item by item, her voice even, her face composed, her gavel present but largely unused. At the end, when she asked for a motion to adjourn, Phil Garrett raised his hand first, which had never happened before in any meeting I'd attended. She recognized him. He moved to adjourn. Gerald seconded. Sandra brought the gavel down. The meeting was over. Afterward, in the parking lot, I was approached by a woman I had never seen before at a Maplewood Ridge event. Young, maybe early 30s, natural hair, a toddler on one hip and a manila folder in the other hand. She said she'd bought a house in the neighborhood 3 months ago and had heard about what had happened and had pulled all the HOA records she could find and had some questions. I gave her my contact information. We exchanged numbers. I told her about Gerald, about the citation review, about the fair housing training schedule. Her name was Imani. She had the same look I recognized from the mirror in April of last year. Determined, clear-eyed, slightly overwhelmed, and not going anywhere. In October, Sandra attended her last 2 board meetings. They were, for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, genuinely uneventful, routine business, unanimous votes, no manufactured drama. The new board member joining in November was a retired teacher named Carl Webb, who had run on a straightforward platform. Transparency, reasonable enforcement, fair process. He won with 71% of the homeowner votes. Donna Weeks had withdrawn. Sandra's remaining ally had decided not to seek re-election either. The new board would be Gerald, me, Phil Garrett, Carl Webb, and 1 remaining neutral member. The math was irreversible. Sandra's last board meeting was on a Wednesday evening in late October. She gavelled it open. She ran the agenda. She gavelled it closed. She collected her papers and stood up and said, to the table generally and to no one in particular, "I hope the community continues to thrive." And then she walked out. Gerald looked at me after she left. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything. Phil Garrett looked at the table. Carl Webb, attending his first meeting as president-elect, cleared his throat and said, "Should we talk about the snow removal contract?" We talked about the snow removal contract. What happened next, what finally happened publicly finally, came not from the board or the settlement or HUD or any process I had initiated, but from the neighborhood itself. In early November, the day before Sandra officially departed the board, a letter was delivered to every mailbox in Maplewood Ridge. All 212 of them. It was unsigned. It was not from the HOA or Greenway or any official body. It was 4 paragraphs, single-spaced, from someone or someones who had been watching for a long time and had decided that a quiet, official ending was not a sufficient ending. The letter named Sandra. It named the specific incidents, the pool, the lien, the citations, the vote manipulation, the executive session called without Gerald, sourcing each claim to the public record. The HUD summary, the citation review report, the settlement terms as published by the Alliance. It named the families who had left before me by name. I learned then that the letter's authors had found them, had spoken to them, had obtained their permission to include their names. It named Gloria Tate. It named Donna Weeks. It told the whole story in 4 paragraphs, and it was completely accurate because every single thing in it had been documented. I did not write that letter. I don't know who did. I have my guesses: Harriet Bloom's precision and legal literacy, Tom Hendricks's long memory for detail, Gloria Tate's willingness to finally name what she'd seen, Patty's deep knowledge of the neighborhood. It might have been all of them. It might have been someone else entirely. I only know that when I found it in my mailbox that morning, I read it standing on my front porch in the November cold, and when I finished I folded it and held it for a moment and said to nobody in particular, "There it is." The whole thing in writing for everyone to read. Sandra did not respond to the letter publicly. Her attorney released a statement, brief, defensive, referencing ongoing legal matters and incomplete information. But that statement was posted on a local news site the same day the letter hit mailboxes, and the comment section was not kind. I didn't read the comments. Patricia told me not to, and she was right, but Patty sent me 2 of them, and they were, Patty noted, really something. I chose to believe her. The formal HOA board transition happened in the first week of November. Routine, procedural, documented in the minutes. Sandra signed the transition documents. She handed over the official HOA seal. Yes, there was a physical seal, and the filing cabinet keys and the binder of community guidelines. Carl Webb received them. Gerald shook her hand. She shook it without visible emotion and walked to the parking lot. I was not there for the transition. I had a shift at the hospital. Gerald texted me, "It's done." I texted back, "Okay." 2 okays. 1 year apart. Both of them meaning everything. In the weeks that followed the board transition, I learned something through Patty's neighborhood intelligence network that I hadn't known. Sandra Pruitt had put her house on the market the previous month, quietly, through an agent in a neighboring town. The listing had gone live in mid-October, before the November letter, before the board transition. She had already been planning to leave. She had already known the board was not salvageable from her position. She had made her calculation and she was going. The pearl and gavel sovereignty of Maplewood Ridge was already over for her before it was over publicly. The house sold in 3 weeks. She was gone by Thanksgiving. No goodbye notice to the listserv. No farewell at a board meeting. She simply was no longer there one day. The house sat empty for about a week. Clean, staged, blinds drawn, and then a moving truck arrived and a new family started unloading boxes. I watched from my front porch. I didn't know them yet. I would eventually. Maplewood Ridge is not a large neighborhood. People find their way to each other. I want to say one thing about Sandra Pruitt that is not about anger or grievance. Whatever she believed about herself, and I think she genuinely believed she was doing something righteous, maintaining something valuable. She was wrong in a way that caused real harm to real people over a period of years. That wrongness is on the record now. It has a paper trail, a federal finding, a 43-page independent review, and a letter in 212 mailboxes. It is not a matter of opinion or perspective. It is documented. That is not everything, but it is something that cannot be undone. Mama came back for Thanksgiving. I drove to Gary and picked her up, which she protested and then accepted, and we talked the whole way back about her church friends and Esther and Ruth and the improvements her landlord had finally made and a new daytime show she'd gotten into. She had her good coat and her church hat and the cornbread in a sealed container balanced on her lap. When we pulled into the driveway where my tires had been flattened, the same driveway where I had groceries once, she looked at the house and said, "The hydrangeas are done for the season." I said they'd be back in May. She said she knew. We went inside. The Thanksgiving table had Marcus at one end and Mama at the other and me in the middle with too much food and not enough chairs, because Patty came over with her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend, and Tom Hendricks stopped by with a pie he'd made himself, which was ambitious and appreciated, and Imani, the new homeowner I'd met in the parking lot, texted to say Happy Thanksgiving and then just showed up an hour later with her toddler and a bottle of wine, which is exactly the kind of thing that makes a neighborhood. I looked around the table at 10:30 that night, dishes half cleared, conversation still going, Mama's laugh filling the kitchen the way it always does, and I thought, this is what she was trying to take. And she couldn't. The new board held its first full meeting in December. All 5 of us, no gavel, Carl Webb in the chair by unanimous consent. The first item of business was the Fair Housing Training Schedule, which we set for February. The second was the citation review process reform, which Gerald had drafted and which we adopted unanimously. The third was a motion to officially rename the Community Standards Compliance process to the Homeowner Support Process. on the grounds that the existing name carried too much punitive freight. Phil Garrett proposed it. I seconded it. Passed. Unanimously. No gavel needed. I got a card from Gloria Tate in December, handwritten, postmarked from the town she lived in. It said, "I have been following what happened. I am glad you didn't leave. I am sorry I did." I read it several times and then put it in the documentation file, not as evidence of anything, just to keep it. Some documents are not about legal processes. Some documents are just about the truth of what happened between people. In January of the new year, I got a call from a woman I didn't know. A homeowner in a community 2 towns over, different HOA, different management company, but the same story. Citations, harassment, a board president who had constructed an apparatus of manufactured compliance around a family that had recently moved in. She had found Patricia's name through the alliance. Patricia had referred her to me. She asked if she could ask me some questions. I said yes. I talked to her for an hour. I told her, document everything. Keep your dates. Find your Gerald. Don't flinch. I thought about that woman after we hung up. I thought about how the thing Sandra had done to me, to Mama, to the families before us, was not unique to Sandra or to Maplewood Ridge. It was a pattern that repeated itself in neighborhoods across this country, in small specific acts of exclusion dressed up as community standards, in the gap between the written rule and the applied rule, in who got the benefit of the doubt and who got the citation. It was old and pervasive, and it depended on its targets not knowing the rules, not keeping the records, not finding each other. We had known the rules. We had kept the records. We had found each other. That was the thing. February brought the first fair housing training session, mandatory for all board members, facilitated by the Alliance. Carl, Gerald, Phil, me, and the 5th board member sat around the conference table at Greenway's office for 4 hours with a trainer named Darnell, who was calm and patient and had clearly done this many times before. The training covered the Fair Housing Act, HOA-specific obligations, disparate impact analysis, documentation requirements, and what to do when a board member becomes aware of potentially discriminatory enforcement. It was thorough. It was necessary. It was, for me personally, something between a vindication and a reminder of how long this should have been in place. Carl Webb, the new board president, was unexpectedly wonderful at this. He asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. He pushed back on Darnell in the productive way, not resistance but genuine intellectual engagement, and by the end of the session he had 2 pages of notes and had already proposed 2 additional procedural reforms that Darnell said were beyond the minimum required but were genuinely good practice. I liked Carl very much. I thought he was going to be a good board president. I was right. March, a year after the petunias. I sat on my front porch on a March Saturday with my coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up around me. A family I didn't know yet walked a dog I did know. A large, gentle German shepherd named Archie, who had been a fixture of the street since before I moved in. Tom Hendricks was in his driveway with his grandson, shooting hoops on the now-approved basketball hoop, the ball making its satisfying sound in the quiet morning. Amani walked by with her toddler in a stroller, saw me on the porch and waved. I waved back. I thought about Sandra. I do still think about her, not obsessively, not with the constant vigilance of the past year, but in the way you think about something that changed the shape of your life. I think about what she thought she was protecting. I think about the families she pushed out and whether she ever understood what she'd done to them. I think about whether the isolation of the past year, the board transition, the article, the letter, the empty house, changed anything for her, or whether she drove to her new neighborhood and found a new board to chair and a new gavel to use and started over. I don't know the answer to that. I probably never will. What I know is this. My name is Renee Williams Carter. I own the house at 14 Birchwood Lane. The hydrangeas are doing well. My mother has a room here whenever she wants it. My brother calls on Sundays. I serve on the HOA board with people who take their responsibilities seriously. I go to work and I take care of people in pain, and I come home to a house that is mine in every sense of the word. Legally, financially, and in the sense of belonging that no piece of paper can fully capture, but that I feel every time I turn the key in the front door. The case taught me something I've been turning over ever since. The people who build these systems of quiet exclusion rely almost entirely on the assumption that their targets are too exhausted, too uncertain of the rules, too isolated, or too afraid of the costs to push back systematically. They are right about that often. The costs are real. The exhaustion is real. The uncertainty is real. But the assumption has a flaw. It only works if you're facing it alone. The moment you're not alone, the assumption collapses. Find your people. Keep your records. Know the rules better than they do. Don't flinch. I called Marcus the day of the first board meeting of the new year, the one without a gavel, with Carl Webb at the head of the table and the fair housing training on the calendar and the homeowner support process newly renamed and the hydrangeas dormant outside and spring still 2 months away. I called him after the meeting, sitting in my car in the community room parking lot the way I always do after meetings now, making myself debrief before I drive. He picked up on the first ring. I said, "First meeting's done." He said, "How'd it go?" I said, "Quietly." He said, "Good." I said, "Yeah." I sat in the parking lot for another minute and then I drove home. Sandra's old house sold to a young couple. I saw them moving in on a cold December afternoon, boxes and furniture and the particular organized chaos of a new beginning. I waved from my driveway. They waved back. I thought about going over to introduce myself and decided to give them a week to settle in first. A week later I brought over a casserole, yes, a casserole exactly like Patty had done for me, and introduced myself and told them where the pool was and that the gate code had recently been changed and that the HOA board met the first Tuesday of the month if they ever wanted to come. They thanked me. They seemed nice. The neighborhood continued. In April, Mama came back for 2 weeks. Not because of anything practical, just because she wanted to see the hydrangeas bloom and because she had told Esther, her Maplewood Ridge Esther, that she'd be back in the spring. She and Esther had coffee every Thursday. She sat on the front porch in the evenings. She went to the community pool on a Saturday with me. The two of us together in the shallow end, Mama in her swimming cap, the one Marcus had sent her for her birthday. Nobody said anything to us. The sun was warm. The pool was quiet. Mama floated on her back for a little while with her face to the sky, and I watched her and thought, there, right there, that's what I was fighting for. I want to end with something Marcus told me, not during the fight, but after it, on the phone one Sunday when things had settled and we were just talking the way we do. He said, "You know what the hardest part was for me, watching all of this?" I said I didn't. He said, "Knowing you were right and knowing I couldn't just fix it for you. Knowing the only way through was the way you were already going." He paused. "You didn't need me to fix it. You just needed me to stay." I said, "That's exactly what I needed." He said, "I know. I'm glad I knew that too." That conversation is the one I come back to when someone asks me, and people have started asking since the Alliance piece and the local coverage and the referral calls from Patricia how I got through it. The answer is, I didn't get through it alone. But I also didn't wait for anyone else to start it. I started it. I kept going. I built the file, I found the allies, I held my position, I didn't flinch. And when it was over I had the same house, the same hydrangeas, the same room for Mama, and also something else. The knowledge that the system, slow and imperfect and grinding as it is, can be made to work. If you know the rules, if you keep the records, if you find your people, if you don't flinch. What is Maplewood Ridge now? It's a neighborhood. It has good days and complicated days. The snow removal contract is a perennial headache. The holiday decoration guidelines are much better but still occasionally contentious. Tom Hendricks's grandson made a three-pointer last Saturday that Tom told me about in such detail that I felt like I'd watched it myself. Imani brought a dish to the spring block party that everyone asked for the recipe for, and she wrote it out on index cards and brought 30 copies, which is exactly the right way to handle that situation. Carl Webb is a good board president. Gerald is reliable. Phil Garrett has, unexpectedly, become someone who speaks up in meetings. The board uses the homeowner support process. The pool is open. The gate code works. Nobody gets cited for their petunias. And if I am honest, fully honest, the way I've been trying to be throughout all of this, I will say that there are still moments when I walk out to my car in the morning and my eyes go to the tires. Just a glance. Old vigilance dying slowly. And then I see that they're fine, they're always fine now, and I get in and drive to work and the morning goes on. That vigilance will fade completely eventually. Things that once felt impossible do, eventually, become simply the shape of ordinary life. That's how healing works when it works. Slowly, not all at once. One ordinary morning at a time. The file on my laptop is still there, 147 pages now, because I added the settlement documentation and the citation review and the HUD summary and a few things I'm keeping for my own reference. I don't open it very often anymore. But I haven't deleted it. Some records should be kept. Some things should not become as if they never happened, because they happen to real people who deserve to have their experience acknowledged, documented, and preserved. My mother was made to shake at the edge of a pool. That happened. And then a great many other things happened, documented, witnessed, and on the record. That happened too. Spring came around again. The hydrangeas bloomed exactly on schedule, reliable as they always are. Big pale blue clusters that the neighbors compliment when they walk by and that I photograph every year and send to Mama and Marcus. I was on the front porch with my coffee when they opened fully. A Tuesday morning in May before my shift, the street quiet and gold in the early light, and I looked at them for a long time. Hydrangeas in their between bloom period are not dead. They are not neglected. They are seasonal. They know exactly when to come back. I thought about that citation from a year ago, and I thought about how wrong Sandra Pruitt had been about so many things, including the hydrangeas. I have been telling the story for a while now, and I want to return to the part that I've held back from, the part one have been building toward because it's the part that almost broke everything open before the legal process could finish its work. I have been telling it in order because that's how I lived it. Sequentially, one document at a time, one meeting at a time. But the truth is there was a moment in all of this, one specific moment, when Sandra Pruitt did something so calculated and so personal that it stripped away every professional composure I had and left me in my driveway at 11 at night holding my phone with shaking hands. I need to tell that part now. It happened in October, the October before the final board meetings, before the transition, before Sandra's house went on the market. I was just coming off a 14-hour shift, running on 2 cups of coffee and the specific hollow alertness that only nurses understand, when I checked my phone. In the parking lot and found 17 missed texts from Patty, 2 from Tom Hendricks, 1 from Gerald marked urgent, and 4 from a number I didn't recognize. The text from Patty said only, "Call me. Now. Please." That's all. I called Patty from the parking lot with my engine running. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was tight. Not panicked, but the controlled tight of someone managing panic carefully, and she told me that my address had been posted in a local Facebook group that afternoon. Not just my address. A post claiming I was running a commercial enterprise out of my home, a home daycare, specifically, without proper licensing or HOA approval. The post named me by full name. It had a photograph of my front porch. It had 140 comments by the time Patty saw it. It had been shared 22 times. I sat in the parking lot for 2 minutes processing what Patty had told me. There was no daycare. There had never been any daycare. I am a registered nurse with hospital shifts. I do not run any commercial enterprise from my home. The post was fabricated, completely, entirely from nothing, and distributed with my full name and address to an audience of several thousand people. Someone had invented a false claim about me and published it where it would spread. And they had done it at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night when I was coming off 14 hours of work. I called Gerald. He had already seen it. He had already screenshotted it. He had already reached out to the Facebook group's administrator asking for the post to be removed, citing false information and potential defamation. He told me the original post had been made by an account created 3 weeks earlier, with no profile photo and 4 friends, a burner account. But the post itself had been written with specific detail. It described the daycare as operating Monday through Friday between 7 and 5:30, with 3 to 4 children regularly present. Those specific details, that level of fabrication, required planning. It was not a random act. I called Patricia Lowe at 11:15 at night. She answered. She has always answered, and I told her what had happened. She said, "Screenshot everything right now before it's removed. Timestamp every screenshot." I was already doing it. I had 62 screenshots by midnight. The post was eventually removed by the Facebook administrator around 1 a.m., about 3 hours after it had been live. But in those 3 hours it had accumulated 187 comments and had been screenshotted and reshared by people who hadn't seen the removal notice. Screenshots live forever. That was part of the calculation. Patricia filed a defamation notice the next morning, preserving our right to pursue legal action. She also filed a supplemental complaint with HUD adding this incident to the record of targeted harassment. And she reached out to the Metropolitan Fair Housing Alliance, which had, by this point, a substantial file on Sandra Pruitt and Maplewood Ridge, and added this new incident to it with something that sounded, even over email, like grim recognition. This kind of harassment, fabricated community reports targeting Black homeowners, was something they had seen before. They had a category for it. That category existing at all was its own kind of horror. Marcus called me that morning. He had seen the post. Patty had sent him a screenshot directly, knowing he'd want to know. He was quiet for most of our conversation, asking factual questions in the clipped, precise way that tells me he's containing something larger underneath. At the end he said, "Is there anything I should be doing from my end that you want done?" The question was careful, deliberately careful. I understood what it was offering and what it was restraining. I said, "Trust the process." There was a pause. He said, "Okay." He said it the same way he'd said okay to the HUD finding, with everything underneath it that the word doesn't show. The burner account was eventually traced, not by law enforcement, which did not have the jurisdictional urgency for a Facebook post, but by a tech-savvy friend of Tom Hendricks who did this kind of thing professionally and who agreed to spend 2 hours on it as a favor when Tom explained the situation. The account had been created from a device that had also, earlier that week, logged into a neighborhood website from an IP address associated with a Maplewood Ridge resident. The resident's name was one of Sandra's board allies, not Sandra, her ally. The information was not admissible in any legal proceeding, but it was documented and it went into the file, and when Patricia and HUD and the Alliance eventually reviewed everything together, it added another thread to the pattern. I did not post about the Facebook incident publicly. I did not respond to any of the comments before the post was removed. I did not name Sandra or her ally on social media. I did not call anyone from the neighborhood who had seen it and expressed sympathy, and there were several, including people I barely knew, who sent me direct messages saying they knew it was false and they were sorry. I thanked them privately and said nothing more publicly. Patricia's advice always, let them be visible. Stay professional. Let the record speak. The Facebook incident changed something in the neighborhood in a way that all the formal proceedings had not quite achieved. Formal proceedings are abstract to most people. A HUD investigation is bureaucratic and distant. A citation review is administrative, a settlement is legal language behind closed doors. But a false post about a neighbor visible on a community Facebook group with a name and a photograph and a specific fabricated claim was immediate and human, and recognized by people who had never paid much attention to HOA procedure as exactly what it was: an attempt to destroy someone's reputation with a lie. People who had been neutral became not neutral, quietly, without announcement. But I felt it. 3 days after the Facebook post, I went to get my mail and found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, handwritten. Inside was a note card with a single sentence: "We know what she's doing and we're watching. You are not alone." And signed. I put it in the file. I don't know who sent it, but I read it 3 times and then I made dinner and went to bed and slept better than I had in 2 weeks. November's board transition happened as scheduled. The day after Sandra handed over the seal and the keys and the filing cabinet, I got home from work and sat on the front porch and let myself feel the specific weight of the past 19 months. From March of the previous year, those 2 terracotta pots of petunias, the first tape citation, to this November evening, with Sandra's name no longer on any active board document, the gavel in Carl Webb's desk drawer, the fair housing training on the February calendar. 19 months. I was still in my house. I was on the board. Mama had a room. The hydrangeas had come back, bloomed, and gone dormant again, reliable as ever. I have been asked, since various pieces of this story became known, whether I feel angry. The answer is yes. I feel angry about what was done to my mother at that pool, and I feel angry about every family that left this neighborhood before me because the system I managed to navigate was not available to them, or they didn't have the documentation, the attorney, the ally on the board, the witness at the pool, the neighbor with the ring camera, the energy, or the specific convergence of support that I was fortunate to have. The system worked for me. That is not a neutral fact. The system is not equally accessible to everyone who faces what I faced. That anger is appropriate and I don't plan to let it go. What I also feel, and this is harder to say without sounding like I'm resolving something too neatly, is that the people of this neighborhood, most of them, are not Sandra. They are Tom Hendricks and Harriet Bloom and Patty and Imani and Esther and Carl Webb and Phil Garrett, who finally found his voice, and Marisol and Linda and Cassie Marsh, who gave me her card at the pool. They are the unsigned note card in my mailbox, and the neighbor who removed the Facebook post, and the newcomers who came to the candidate coffee, and the man on the far side of the neighborhood who shook my hand before I'd finished a sentence. This neighborhood is also them. It always was. I want to tell you about the pool. Not the June pool, the humiliation pool, the pool where this whole story cracked open. I want to tell you about the pool the following August, a year later, after everything. Mama was visiting. It was a Saturday, the same kind of day, 88 degrees, low humidity, the kind of day that feels like a gift. Mama and I walked to the pool together. We had our towels and our sunscreen and our pool passes and our swimming caps. 2 of them because Marcus still sends them in pairs, both sizes, because that is who he is. We got there early enough to get good chairs, the ones that face the open end of the pool and get afternoon shade from the oak tree. We settled in. Mama put her feet in the water.
I sat beside her.
The pool filled up gradually. Families, kids, neighbors I recognized, neighbors I didn't. Nobody said anything to us. The gate opened and closed. The sun moved. Mama floated on her back for a little while, face to the sky, the same as she'd done the previous spring when I'd watched her and thought, this is what I was fighting for. She floated.
I sat.
The afternoon was ordinary and entirely, completely ours. At some point Mama opened her eyes and looked at the sky, and then looked at me and said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "That woman's face. When you walked in that day." I said, "Sandra." She said, "The moment she saw you coming. That flicker." I hadn't thought about that in a while. I thought about it now. Sandra, that June day, watching me come through the gate at a full run. The clipboard. The practiced calm. And then, for 1 second, something else, a recalculation. Marcus had described it at the pool with him too. She recalculates. She sees someone she didn't anticipate and she recalculates. What she didn't calculate, ultimately, was the full weight of what she'd set in motion. That's usually how it goes. Mama and I stayed at the pool until 4 in the afternoon. On the way home, she stopped at the base of the steps to my porch, looked at the hydrangeas, already done for the season by August, in there between bloom state, and said, "I know they'll be back." I said, "They always are." She went inside to start dinner. I sat on the porch for a minute, alone, and looked at the neighborhood in the late afternoon light. Tom's basketball hoop, Marisol's wind chime, Imani walking by with the stroller. The steady, ordinary life of a place where people lived, which was what I'd come here for and what I'd stayed for and what was finally just the shape of things. There is one more thing I haven't told you. I've been saving it because it was the thing that undid me the most, not with anger or grief, but with the particular emotion that doesn't have a good name, the one that's made of equal parts fury and love and recognition and the specific ache of being known. I found it on a Sunday morning in late November, after the board transition, going through some old papers in my home office. It was a letter handwritten on lined paper, in a careful cursive hand that I recognized immediately because it's the same hand that signed my birthday cards for 46 years. Mama had written me a letter. She must have written it sometime during her 11 months with me. I couldn't pinpoint when exactly, and tucked it in a folder of papers she'd left in the guest room closet, which she'd labeled for Renee in pen on the tab. Inside the folder was the letter, 3 pages, and folded inside the letter was the HOA pool pass. The one she'd been carrying that June Saturday. She'd kept it. I won't share all of the letter, because it belongs to me and to her. But I will tell you that she wrote about the pool. She wrote about what it felt like to have someone look at her the way Sandra had looked at her. Like she was a problem to be managed. Like she was out of place in her own daughter's neighborhood. She wrote that she had been afraid to tell me how much it had shaken her, because she hadn't wanted to make my fight harder. She wrote, "You fought for my right to put my feet in that water. That's the kind of thing your daddy would have done. That's the kind of thing I tried to raise you to do. You did it exactly right." She signed it. "Love always, your mama, Dorothy May." I sat in my home office for a long time after reading it. The pool pass was in my hands. The paper was worn at the fold lines. She'd carried it in her pocket that whole day and hadn't thrown it away afterward. She had kept it as a document the way I keep documents. That's where I learned it, I realized. Not from the nursing degree or the HOA wars or the legal files or the 20 years of professional self-discipline. From her. From watching her handle things with dignity and continue and not let anyone take what was hers. That was where I learned it. The pool pass is in my documentation file now. 148 pages. It's on the last page. I figure it belongs there at the end after everything as the thing the whole file was really about. Not the citations or the lien or the HUD finding or the settlement terms. A worn paper pool pass that my 74-year-old mother carried in her pocket because she had a right to go swimming in her daughter's neighborhood on a summer Saturday, and she knew it. I think about what Sandra saw versus what was actually there. She saw an old black woman in a swimming cap who she thought didn't belong. What was actually there was Dorothy May Williams. 4 children raised, a husband buried, a flooded apartment endured, a daughter's porch watched from with a cup of decaf, a pool walked to on an 88-degree day with her pass in her pocket and her rights intact. She was the daughter of sharecroppers who had bought land with their own money. She was the wife of a union man who'd been blacklisted for organizing. She was the mother of a naval officer and a registered nurse. She was not afraid of Sandra Pruitt. She was just choosing, for a moment, not to show it. She showed me instead. In 3 pages of careful cursive, she showed me everything. What does a community look like when it's working? It looks like Harriet Bloom and her binder. It looks like Tom Hendricks's grandson making a three-pointer in the driveway. It looks like Imani with 30 recipe cards at the block party. It looks like Carl Webb asking follow-up questions at the fair housing training. It looks like Phil Garrett finally raising his hand. It looks like a casserole delivered to a new neighbor who didn't know anyone yet and was uncertain and hopeful in equal measure. It looks like people who disagreed and people who watched too long and people who eventually stepped forward, and all of them together constituting something more complicated and more resilient than any one person's vision of community control. I have one regret. I wish I had found Gloria Tate sooner, not for the legal case, but for her. 6 years of watching and choosing silence is a weight. She's been carrying it. She told me when I called her after the settlement that being contacted by HUD, being asked to give a statement that would be used in an actual proceeding, had felt like something she'd owed people for years and was finally able to pay. I told her that what she'd done had mattered enormously and that I was grateful. She said she wished she'd done it sooner. I said we do things when we can do them. She said, I suppose. She sounded a little less tired than she had over coffee in May of the previous year. I'll take that. Gerald retired from the HOA board in January of the new year. Not forced out, just genuinely ready to step back. He had served for 4 years at that point, and the past 2 had been more than he'd signed up for when he joined to be useful. He told me at his last meeting that he was glad he'd stayed for all of it. He said, I've been thinking about what I should have done differently in the years before you arrived, when things were already wrong but I was working around them instead of confronting them. He paused. I hope the next board member they get in here starts earlier. I said, me too. I meant both meanings of that. Imani ran for Gerald's seat. She won. Her platform was 3 things: transparency, process integrity, and her phrase, which I loved, enforcement that works for everyone who lives here. She knocked on every door in the neighborhood, which I know because she texted me updates from her door-knocking sessions with the competitive energy of someone who has found something she's genuinely good at. She won with 74% of the vote. Gerald shook her hand at the transition and said something to her that I wasn't close enough to hear. She told me later that he'd said, the baton matters more than the runner. I told her I thought that was exactly right. The neighborhood is different now. Not transformed, nothing real transforms quickly or completely, but different. The citation rate is down substantially since the new process was implemented. I see the reports as a board member and the numbers are clear. The pool is full on summer weekends. The block party last spring was the best attended in 7 years, according to Greenway's records. These are small facts, but small facts accumulated in the right direction become the character of a place. The character of Maplewood Ridge is changing slowly from what Sandra Pruitt had made of it into something else. Something that was already here in most of its people waiting to be the shape of things. In the second spring after all of it, the hydrangeas bloomed so fully that the bushes nearly covered the front step. I had done nothing special to them. Same care as always, the right amount of water, some pruning in late winter, letting them do what they do. Patty said they were the best hydrangeas on the street. I said they'd been cited for noncompliance once. She laughed. I took a photograph and sent it to Mama and Marcus with the caption "non-compliant." Marcus sent back a laughing emoji. Mama sent back a flower. Those 3 things together on my phone screen, that felt like something close to the ending of the story, though the story doesn't really end, neighborhoods don't end, people keep arriving and leaving and the gates keep opening and the hydrangeas keep coming back. But I want to give you the ending you came for, the ha-he moment, the one where Sandra Pruitt's carefully constructed kingdom of manufactured rules and social leverage finally came fully, publicly, unmistakably down. So let me tell you about the community pool's summer reopening ceremony in June, the anniversary of the day everything started, almost to the week, which the new board decided to mark as the first community event of the reorganized HOA. Carl Webb's idea. He suggested a cookout, a dedication of the updated pool policy printed and framed on the wall by the entrance, and an informal acknowledgement of the changes the community had made. He suggested inviting anyone who wanted to speak. He suggested starting at noon. The pool reopening was a Saturday. About 80 people came. Someone brought a portable speaker. Someone else brought enough hot dogs for twice that number, which is the correct approach. The new pool policy was framed and mounted by the entrance, next to a copy of the fair housing notice that was now also a permanent fixture. Carl welcomed everyone briefly and efficiently, which is his style, and then opened the floor. 5 people spoke. Tom about the basketball hoop, Marisol about her grandmother's wind chime, a family I barely knew who'd recently moved in and said they'd chosen Maplewood Ridge because of what they'd read about the community changes, Harriet Bloom, who simply said, "The binder is retired but available if needed," and sat back down to applause, and Imani, who said, clearly and without preamble, "This neighborhood belongs to everyone who lives here." That should not have needed to be said. It does now. Good. I did not speak at the pool reopening. It didn't feel like my moment, it felt like the community's moment, and the community was already speaking for itself. I sat in a pool chair in the afternoon sun with Mama, who had come down from Gary for the occasion because I told her about it and she'd said, "I'd like to see that pool again under different circumstances." She was in her swimming cap. She had her pool pass in the front pocket of her beach bag. She was wearing her good sunglasses and had brought a bottle of lemonade that she poured into 2 cups, one for her and one for me. We sat and listened to people talk and applauded when others applauded. Then the speeches ended and people got in the water and the afternoon happened the way good afternoons do. Gradually, warmly, without drama. Somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, Mama tapped my arm and pointed across the pool. On the far side, a little girl of about 4 was at the edge of the water with floaties on, being coaxed in by what looked like her grandmother, white-haired, laughing, reaching out her hands. The little girl was uncertain for a moment. Then she jumped. The grandmother caught her. There was shrieking and splashing and laughter. I watched it and thought about a lot of things at once and didn't say any of them. Mama patted my arm, patted hers back. That evening, after Mama had gone in and the pool was empty and the folding tables were being put away by Carl and Tom and a couple of teenagers who'd stayed to help, I walked to the pool gate and looked back at it, the framed policy, the fair housing notice, the clean water in the late daylight, and I thought about Sandra's gavel. 400-and-something days of that gavel. Click, 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 like she could hammer the neighborhood into the shape she wanted it to be. And I thought about Carl's first board meeting, running without a gavel, the agenda moving on its own merits, no one person with a hand on the wheel of everything. That's the better thing. It's slower and less tidy and requires people to actually agree instead of just comply. But it's the better thing. Sandra Pruitt did not attend the pool reopening. She was, by that point, no longer in Maplewood Ridge, no longer on the board, no longer, as far as anyone who lived here was concerned, any part of what this neighborhood was becoming. I did not think about her much that day. Only once, briefly, when I was settling into my pool chair and looked at the gate my mother had come through the previous June, trembling, pool pass in hand, trying not to cause trouble. I looked at it, and then I looked away and I put on my sunglasses and handed Mama her lemonade. Here is what I know about Sandra Pruitt. Finally, completely, and without appetite for further investigation. She was someone who found power in a small arena and used it to harm people who she had decided didn't belong in her neighborhood. She did it systematically. She did it over years. She did it to my mother at a pool on a June Saturday when the temperature was 88 degrees and the only thing my mother wanted was to put her feet in the water. And she lost. Not gracefully, not quietly, not without consequences. She lost the case, the board, the community's trust, and eventually the neighborhood itself. The record is there. The finding is there. The apology letter is there, signed with her own name. Whatever she does next, those things exist. My mother exists. Dorothy Mae Williams, 74 years old, who has a room in my house and a standing invitation and a pool pass that she keeps in her purse even when she's back in Gary, Indiana, because she thinks it's funny and because she told me this on the phone one Sunday evening. She just likes having it. It reminds me, she said. I asked what it reminds her of. She said, that you fought for it, that I'm worth fighting for. I said, you always have been. She said, I know, but it was nice to see it demonstrated. She laughed. I laughed. We talked for another 40 minutes about entirely unrelated things and then said good night. Marcus called the following Sunday, as he always does. He asked how things were going. I said they were going well, quietly, which was the best way. He said, boring is good. I said, boring is very good. He asked about Mama. I said she was fine. She'd been to the doctor. Everything was okay. She'd found a new daytime show. He said he was coming up at the end of the month. I said I'd make sure there was food. He said don't bother, he'd bring Popeyes. I said that was the correct decision. He laughed. We talked for a while about nothing in particular. He asked if I'd opened the documentation file recently. I said no. He said, good. The documentation file is closed now. Not deleted, I will never delete it, but closed. 148 pages. The pool pass is still on the last page. The case is resolved, the board is changed, the neighborhood is shifting, the hydrangeas came back. The file is a record of something that happened, and something that was done about it, and I keep it the way you keep a scar that has fully healed. Not to suffer, but to remember and to know exactly what you're capable of surviving. There is a particular thing I notice now, something I didn't notice before all of this started. When I pull into my driveway after a shift, even a long one, even a hard one, and I see the house, the blue shutters and the hydrangeas and the front porch with its lights that can now be any color I want, I feel something that isn't just relief. Something more specific than that. It's ownership in the fullest sense, not the legal sense, not the deed and mortgage sense, but the sense of having fought for a place and earned the right to call it yours in a way that cannot be challenged, documented, leaned, or cited away. The house was always mine on paper. Now it's mine in every sense there is. That took 19 months and 148 pages, and it was worth every single one. I want to walk you back to October, the dark October, the one with the Facebook post, because I skipped over something in my account of the escalation that I need to come back to. It's about Marcus and what he actually did, which is not the same as what he said he'd do or what I understood him to be doing at the time. I found out about it afterward. I've thought about whether to include it. I'm including it because it's part of the truth. When Marcus saw the Facebook post, the one claiming I was running an unlicensed daycare, he made a call to someone he knew in the county sheriff's department, not to report a crime, not to interfere with anything. He called to ask a specific question: whether a fabricated anonymous social media post targeting a named individual's residence with a false commercial activity claim could constitute anything actionable under state harassment statutes. The answer he received was, possibly, depending on demonstrated intent and pattern. He did nothing further with that information. He did not take any action. But he had asked the question and he had gotten the answer and he had filed it away. That is what Marcus does. He gathers information and he waits and he does not act until the time is exactly right, or until he concludes that the time has passed and acting would cost more than it gains. He told me about that call 11 months later, after everything was resolved, over the phone on a Sunday. He told me because he thought I deserved to know what he'd been doing in those months when he seemed to be just reading his paperback and making breakfast. He had not been just reading his paperback and making breakfast. He had been watching, gathering, calculating the odds on every possible path, and choosing every single time to trust the one we were already on. He said, I was not always sure we were going to make it. I said, I was not always sure either. He said, but we kept going. I said, yes. He said, that's the thing. That's always the thing. There was a moment late September, just before everything started to resolve, when I was closest to the edge. Not of giving up exactly, more of a specific fear. That all the documentation, all the legal process, all the alliances I'd built, would ultimately not be enough. That Sandra's ability to manufacture legitimacy would outlast my ability to contest it. That the system I was trusting to work was going to fail me the way systems had failed the families before me who hadn't had my resources, my attorney, my Gerald. I lay in bed at 3 in the morning for about an hour with that fear and let it be fully present, because I've learned that suppressing fear doesn't make it smaller, it just makes it sneak up on you sideways. And then I thought about Mama's letter. I had read it multiple times by then. I found it mid-November, which I realize now I told out of sequence earlier in this account. The truth is I had found a draft of it earlier, in October, when I was looking for a folder in the guest room closet and it had slipped to the back and I only found the full version later when she left. The draft was 3 lines, written and crossed out and started again. The crossing out was more devastating than the letter. Somehow. She'd been trying for a while to say it right. I thought about those crossed out lines in the 3 a.m. dark of late September and I thought, she tried again and she got it right. That's what you do. You try again and you get it right or you get close enough to right that it counts. I got up and drank water and went back to bed and slept 4 hours and got up for a shift. That was the closest edge. After that, it was all forward motion. The final hearing in the formal HUD conciliation process was a conference call, me, Patricia, the HOA's outside counsel, Greenway's attorney, and a HUD mediator named Teresa. It lasted 3 hours. The terms we had been negotiating were confirmed one by one, each side confirming acceptance. When we reached item 2, the formal apology to Dorothy Mae Williams, signed by all board members, there was a pause on the HOA council's end. A very specific pause. Then, confirmed. I wrote that word in my legal pad. Confirmed. That pause and that word. Teresa, the HUD mediator, was efficient and entirely neutral throughout the 3 hours, which is exactly the correct approach for that role. At the very end, after confirmation of all terms, she said, "Is there anything else either party wishes to put on record?" I said no. HOA counsel said no. Teresa said, "Then I'll note that the conciliation agreement has been accepted by all parties and will be executed in writing within 30 days. This proceeding is concluded." She ended the call. I put down my legal pad. Patricia said, "Renee." I said, "I know." She said, "Let yourself have this one." I did. The 30 days passed. The signed agreement arrived by certified mail and by email simultaneously. Patricia had insisted on both because Patricia insists on everything in writing, which is why she is excellent at her job. I signed my copy at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, with Mama watching from across the table and Marcus on the phone because he'd asked me to call him when I signed. I told him when I picked up the pen. He said, "Go ahead." I signed. He said, "Okay. One more okay." It meant exactly what they all meant. After the call, Mama made tea. We sat at the kitchen table without talking for a little while. The television was on low in the other room. The kitchen light was warm. Outside, the November dark had come down early the way it does, and the street was quiet. I thought about Mama's signed apology letter, which was upstairs in my file, and about Sandra's signature on it. That thin, controlled cursive that I had watched sign so many documents and that was now attached, permanently, to an admission of wrong. That signature was not extracted under duress. It was delivered as a condition of settlement, which means it was chosen. That was the part that sat with me. She chose to sign it. At some level, she understood that she had no other viable option, and she signed it. The signature exists. I have it. There is something I should tell you that I have not yet told you, because it happened after the main story had concluded and I didn't know, for a while, whether it was part of the story or just aftermath. It is both. In February of the next year, 7 months after the settlement, I received a letter from a woman in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. She had read the Alliance newsletter piece. She had done some research and found Patricia's name, and Patricia had, with my permission, given her my email, and she had written me a 4-page letter. Her name was Veronica. She and her mother had left an HOA community 4 years ago after an 18-month campaign of citations and harassment that she described in detail. I recognized in every particular. They had not had a Patricia. They had not had a Gerald. They had left. Her mother had died the following year, not because of the HOA's separate illness, but Veronica wrote, she never got to sit comfortably in a neighborhood again. She always felt like she was borrowing someone else's space. I read that sentence 4 times. I wrote Veronica back. I told her I was sorry for what had happened to her mother. I told her about the Alliance and about fair housing resources and about the importance of documentation even after the fact. I told her that what she'd experienced was real, was wrong, and was documented enough times now by enough people to constitute something that the law recognized and could act on. And I told her that her mother had not been wrong to feel that she belonged. She had belonged, and the feeling of not belonging had been manufactured and enforced against her by people who should have known better and didn't stop. Veronica wrote back 2 days later, 2 sentences. Thank you for saying that. I needed someone to say that out loud. I still have that email. I keep everything. There are about a dozen Veronicas now, women and families who have reached out to me, through Patricia or the Alliance or directly, since the story became partially public. I talk to all of them. I share what I know. I refer them to Patricia when I can. Some of them are mid-fight, documenting furiously, looking for their Gerald. Some are post-fight processing, working out what happened. One family eventually moved back to the neighborhood they'd been pushed out of. They found their situation had changed while they were gone. A board election, a new management company, a fair housing complaint that someone else had brought. They moved back into their house. They sent me a photograph. Their children in the yard, the house behind them. I printed it and put it in the documentation file. Page 149. I have been asked by reporters and by people who follow these cases whether I think Sandra Pruitt understood what she was doing, whether she knew she was discriminating, whether the intent was racial. I have thought about this question a lot. I don't know the content of her internal experience. I don't know what she told herself privately about what she was doing and why. What I know is that the effect of what she did was discriminatory, documented, and found by a federal agency to constitute a violation of fair housing law. Intent is legally significant in some contexts and not in others. In the court of what actually happened to real people, to Mama at the pool, to the families who left, to Veronica's mother who never sat comfortably in a neighborhood again, the intent is less important to me than the effect. The effect was real. The effect is in the record. I want to tell you what Mama said about Sandra when I asked her directly, a year after the pool incident, what she thought about the whole thing. We were sitting on the back porch in the evening, the one that faces the backyard, the same window Mama had stood at the first morning and said, "You did real good." I said, "Mama, what do you make of Sandra Pruitt?" She thought for a long time. Mama takes questions seriously, she always has. And then she said, "She was afraid." I said I didn't understand. She said, "When I was growing up in Mississippi, there were a lot of people like her. Afraid that if you had what they had, somehow they'd have less of it. Doesn't make sense, but fear doesn't make sense." She paused. "I feel sorry for her a little." I said I wasn't there yet. She said, "You don't have to be. I'm 74. I've had more time." There is a word I've been trying not to use too loosely throughout this account. Justice. I am cautious about that word because it implies completeness, and this situation, like all situations involving systemic harm, is not complete. The families who left are not fully restored. Veronica's mother is gone. The years of quiet exclusion before I arrived, before anyone pushed back with sufficient documentation and legal support, those years cannot be undone by a settlement and a training requirement and a reframed citation process. What was done was done. The record now acknowledges it. That is meaningful, and it is not enough, and both things are true simultaneously. What I can say is this: within the scope of what was possible, within this specific community, at this specific time, with these specific people and this specific legal framework, something close to justice happened. A wrong was named. Pattern was documented. Policy structure was changed. An apology was signed. A woman who had been made to feel she didn't belong was told, in writing, that she did. The community that she had loved enough to go to the pool by herself on an 88-degree day got to see the pool policy on the wall by the gate, printed and framed and fair. That is not nothing. I have said that before. It bears saying again. I live in my house. The hydrangeas are in the front yard. The guest room is Mama's. The Christmas lights this year are blue and gold and impeccably non-compliant. The board meets without a gavel. The citations are reviewed by a fair process. The pool is open to everyone who lives here. The documentation file is closed. The pool pass is on page 148. Sandra Pruitt's house down the street has a new family in it, young and energetic and full of boxes they haven't finished unpacking, and kids who leave bikes on the front walk, which under the old guidelines would have been a citation and under the new guidelines is just a Tuesday. I have been asked to write all of this down. Not the formal legal account that exists in many forms and many files, but this, the account of living it. The 19 months of documentation and vigilance and fear at 3 a.m. and driving home from meetings and sitting in parking lots and calling Marcus and reading Mama's letter and looking at my hydrangeas and going to work and coming home and going to work and coming home. Someone asked me if it was worth it. I said, it was necessary. Those aren't the same thing, but in this case they had the same answer. The thing I keep coming back to, the image that stays, is Mama in the pool. Not the June pool, the wrong one. The August pool, the anniversary pool, the one where she floated on her back with her face to the sky. I was sitting in the chair beside her with my sunscreen and my coffee thermos and my pool pass in my bag, and for about 10 minutes she just floated, completely still, completely at ease, her swimming cap bright in the afternoon sun. No one said anything to her. No one with a clipboard came. The gate opened and closed. People moved in and out of the water. The afternoon was ordinary. She was entitled to every second of it. She had always been entitled to every second of it. It took 19 months and 148 pages to make sure she knew it and the neighborhood knew it too. That image, Mama floating, is the thing I keep when I'm asked what I was fighting for. Not the legal outcome, not the board seat, not even the apology, though I am grateful for all of those. It's that 10 minutes. It's the ordinariness of them. It's the fact that a 74-year-old black woman in a swimming cap floated in a neighborhood pool on an August afternoon and nobody made her feel she shouldn't be there. That is the whole thing. That is the entirety of what I wanted. That I got it after everything it cost still makes me put my hand to my chest when I think about it in a certain way. And now here is the part one have been building toward, the part that happened at the pool reopening that I described, but that I withheld one element of because I wanted to tell it last, because it is the thing that closes the circle most completely and I wanted to give it the space it deserves. Near the end of the afternoon at the pool reopening, when the crowd had thinned a little and Mama and I were sitting in our chairs with the last of her lemonade, a woman walked through the gate that I recognized but had not expected to see there. It was Donna Weeks. Donna Weeks, who had been Sandra's board ally for 3 years, who had voted yes on every citation, every policy, every motion Sandra wanted passed, who had withdrawn her board candidacy after speaking voluntarily to HUD, who had, in some way I still didn't fully know the contours of, decided that something mattered more than her arrangement with Sandra. She was alone, in casual clothes, carrying a folded towel. She stopped when she saw me. We looked at each other for a moment. I want to be honest. My first instinct was not warmth. My first instinct was the specific wariness of someone who has spent 19 months building a file because they've learned not to assume goodwill. But I also remembered what Patricia had told me about the conciliation process, that Donna's voluntary statement to HUD had been significant, that specific word, and that its significance was partly about what it documented and partly about the fact that she had chosen, at some cost to herself, to step forward. She had not done everything right, but she had done something right at the moment it mattered, and that was not nothing. She came over. She said, "I didn't know if I should come today." I said, "It's a community event. You live here." She nodded. She looked at the framed pool policy by the gate. She looked at the fair housing notice. She looked at the water. She said, "I should have stopped it sooner." I said, "Yes." No qualification. No softening. She nodded again. Then she spread her towel on a chair 2 down from us and sat down. Mama looked at her, looked at me, and looked back at the pool. After a moment, Mama said, pleasantly, in the direction of no one in particular, "It's a beautiful day for it." Donna said, "Yes, it is." That was all. We sat in the sun. The afternoon was ordinary. The pool pass on page 148. The apology letter, signed by Sandra Pruitt, in the folder marked Legal Settlement. The documentation file closed but intact. The hydrangeas, seasonal and reliable. The guest room, Mama's whenever she wants it. The board meetings, no gavel, fair process. The basketball hoop, the wind chime, the Christmas lights in all their non-compliant colors. The family in Sandra's old house with their unpacked boxes and their Tuesday bikes. Imani with her 30 recipe cards. Harriet Bloom's binder, retired but available. Tom Hendricks's three-pointer on a Saturday morning. Gerald's retirement. Imani's 74%. Carl Webb's follow-up questions. Phil Garrett finally raising his hand. Donna Weeks at the pool reopening in her casual clothes. Mama floating on her back, face to the sky. Renee Williams Carter. 14 Birchwood Lane. Blue shutters. Hydrangeas. The house I bought with 20 years of night shifts and overtime. The house I almost let someone take from me by making me too exhausted to fight. The house I didn't leave. The house I'm in right now, at the kitchen table where I've written most of this, with my coffee going cold beside me and the afternoon light coming through the window the way it does in May, warm and long, full of the particular generosity of late spring in a place where you belong and know it. I am not the kind of person who has ever thought of herself as brave. Brave implies choice in the dramatic sense, the moment of decision, the crossroads, the leap. What I did was less cinematic than that. I documented. I filed. I attended meetings. I knocked on doors. I called Patricia. I talked to Marcus. I made cornbread with Mama. I kept the file. I went to work. I came home. I didn't flinch. That is not brave exactly. It is more like stubborn in the best possible sense. The stubborn continuity of a person who has decided that this is where they live and has let that decision be final. Mama called this morning. She asked how the hydrangeas are doing. I said they're beautiful. She said she knows. She saw the photo I sent last week. She just wanted to hear me say it. I said they're coming in full and pale blue and right on schedule. She said that's good. She said she'll be down in July. I said I'll put fresh sheets on the guest room bed. She said don't bother. She'll do it herself. I said I know she will. We talked for a while about her church and about Marcus and about a news story she'd seen. Before she hung up, she said, "You doing good, baby?" I said yes. She said, "I know you are." She said good night even though it was 10 in the morning because that is just what she says at the end of calls. I put my phone down and finished my coffee and looked out the window at the hydrangeas and at the street beyond them. Quiet, May warm, ordinary, and I thought, here, this is the ending. Not the settlement or the board or the HUD finding, as necessary as all of those were. The ending is the ordinary morning. The ending is the coffee and the window and the call from Mama and the hydrangeas on schedule. The ending is the house being the house, mine, inhabited, safe, ordinary, and exactly where I said it would be when I signed those papers and cried in the parking lot of the title company 6 years ago. There is one more call I want to tell you about. It came in March, late March, early evening, a number I didn't recognize but with an area code from the south suburbs. I almost didn't pick up. I picked up. A woman's voice, older, with the particular cadence of someone who has been preparing what they want to say. She said, "Is this Renee Williams, Carter?" I said yes. She said, "My name is Alice Pemberton. I lived on Birchwood Lane from 2018 to 2020. She paused. I understood immediately. She was one of the families. She said, "I saw what happened, what you did, and I wanted to call and tell you I'm glad someone stayed." Her voice cracked a little on stayed. I said, "I'm glad you called." She said, "I wish I'd been able to." She stopped. I said, "I know." She said, "You didn't leave." I said, "No." There was a long, full silence. Then she said, "Good." We talked for 40 minutes. She told me about her house on Birchwood Lane, the one she'd loved, the hydrangeas she'd planted that were probably still there. I told her about the citation review. I told her the street looked the same. I told her she'd been right to love it. After I hung up with Alice Pemberton, I stood in my kitchen for a while without moving. I thought about all the invisible threads of this story. The people I'd never fully know, the families who'd left, the cases that never got documented, the compliance that was really capitulation, the neighborhoods all over this country where some version of Sandra Pruitt had made someone feel that they didn't belong. I thought about Mama's line. She was afraid. Fear doesn't make sense. I thought about what Mama said after that, the part one didn't quote earlier. But the thing about fear, she said, is it gives out eventually. It's not sustainable. You outlast it. You just have to be there long enough. I was there long enough. I'm still here. The documentation file is 148 pages. I am not adding any more. The pool pass is on page 148, and that is where this file ends and this story ends and the ordinary life begins, or rather continues, because the ordinary life was happening all along underneath the fight, sustaining it, being what it was for. A house. A room for Mama. A Sunday call from Marcus. Coffee in the morning. Hydrangeas on schedule. The gate to the pool opening and closing. Come in. You belong here. Come in. I want to tell you about the moment it all broke open publicly. Not the meeting, not the article, not the letter, but the specific human moment when Sandra Pruitt's composure finally cracked in front of witnesses, when the mask came all the way off and the thing underneath it was visible to everyone in the room and could not be walked back. It happened at the August board meeting, the one after the citation review report was published and the local journalist's article was online and the neighborhood had read everything. I told you about the 4 residents who spoke during public comment. I did not tell you what happened after. After James Lee finished speaking, James, who had received 18 citations in 2 years on a fixed income and who spoke for 4 minutes with the measured devastation of someone who has been waiting to say something true in public for a very long time, Sandra began speaking to close the public comment period. She was composed. She said the board appreciated the comments and would review them through the appropriate governance channels. She said the citation review process was a settlement term and reflected the HOA's commitment to continuous improvement. She said these things in the even, practiced tone she had always used in public. And then Harriet Bloom said, from the third row, Can you tell us who initiated the citation that led to Ms. Williams Carter's mother being removed from the pool in June of last year? The room went quiet in a specific way. The way a room goes quiet when a question has been asked that everyone has been thinking and no one expected to hear said out loud so clearly, with such a calm specificity of language. Sandra looked at Harriet. Harriet looked back. Sandra's composure held for 3 seconds. Then something shifted in her face. Not a dramatic crack, not a collapse, but a kind of flicker, the same word Marcus had used, that particular involuntary recalculation when you encounter something you didn't prepare for. And she said, "The pool incident was handled according to community guidelines at the time." Harriet said, "But there were no community guidelines covering that situation. The policy you cited had never been voted on. That's documented in the settlement agreement. So who made the decision to approach a 74-year-old woman at the pool that day and tell her she didn't belong there?" She said it without heat. She said it the way a paralegal of 30 years asks a question, precisely with the full weight of the answer already known. Sandra said, "I acted on my understanding of the rules." Harriet said, "Your understanding of a rule that didn't exist." And Sandra said, and the room heard her say this, all 60 people in that room heard it, "I was trying to maintain the character of the community. The character of the community." I was in the second row and I heard those words and I wrote them in my notebook with the date and time and I felt something cold and clear move through me, because there was the thing that had been underneath all of it, in 6 words, said out loud in front of witnesses, recorded in someone's phone and someone's notes and the memory of every person in that room. The character of the community. What character? Whose character? Maintained against whom? The room heard it. The room sat with it. And then Carl Webb, who had been in the audience that night as president-elect, stood up from his seat and said quietly, "I think we all know now what we needed to know." Nobody disagreed. Sandra did not pick up the gavel. That sentence, "I was trying to maintain the character of the community," went into my notes, into Patricia's file, into the supplemental record for the HUD investigation, into the Alliance's documentation. Raymond Cruz, when I relayed it to him, was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's on the record?" I said yes. He said, "That's going to matter." It mattered. It mattered in the conciliation process, and it mattered in the settlement terms, and it mattered when Sandra's attorney was negotiating what she would and would not sign. 6 words. Documented. Witnessed. True. What I want you to understand about that moment, the character of the community moment, is that it was not my victory exactly. It was the community's moment. Harriet Bloom asked the question. The room sat with the answer. Carl Webb named what it meant. Sandra said the true thing, the thing that had always been underneath the citations and the manufactured rules and the gavel and the pearls, and she said it in front of the people she had claimed to be protecting. And the people she had claimed to be protecting did not agree. They sat in that room and they did not agree. That was the thing. That was the moment the community decided what it was, publicly and collectively, and it decided it was not what Sandra Pruitt had been building. Gerald told me afterward that the August meeting had been the turning point for Phil Garrett. Not the earlier meetings, not the internal board discussions, the August meeting. He had seen what the community thought. He had heard 6 words and watched what happened after them. And the next board meeting, when Sandra attempted to move to new business after public comment, Phil Garrett had raised his hand and asked to address the board's response to the citation review. He had never done that before. He did it then. He was quiet but specific and did not defer to Sandra for the answer. That was the moment Phil Garrett chose a side. He chose the right one. Better late than never is a real thing. The morning after the August meeting, I sent a text to Marcus with Harriet's question and Sandra's answer. I had written them down verbatim in my notebook and typed them out exactly. He read it and responded with 3 words. There it is. That was everything. There it was, the thing that had been true from the beginning, said out loud, by the person who'd been doing it in front of witnesses. The whole edifice of plausible deniability, procedural cover, administrative language, and careful composure, cracked by 6 words and 1 woman with a paralegal's precision and a 3-decade-old binder. I love Harriet Bloom. I will love her for the rest of my life. After the board transition, after Sandra left and the new board settled in and the pool reopening happened and Donna Weeks came through the gate and Mama floated on her back and the afternoon was ordinary. After all of that, there was one formal event remaining. The fair housing training in February. I attended it as a board member. I sat at the table with Carl and Gerald and Phil and Imani and listened to Darnell explain the law. At one point he described a scenario. An HOA president who selectively enforces rules against residents of color using manufactured or ambiguous guidelines, escalating when challenged, retaliating through financial mechanisms, while maintaining procedural cover. He asked the board how they would identify and respond to that scenario in their community. I did not say anything. I let the others answer. Imani's answer was the best one. She said, "Document everything. Believe the person reporting. Check whether the rule actually exists." Darnell said, "Perfect. I wrote it in my notebook. Perfect. The settlement checks cleared in July. I will not tell you the amounts. What I will tell you is that the portion allocated to compensatory damages, the part that was specifically for the harm done to my mother and to me, I split in half. Half I put in savings. Half I sent to the Metropolitan Fair Housing Alliance because they had been part of making this possible, and because there are other families in other neighborhoods and they need someone in their corner when they don't have what I had." Patricia said the donation was one of the largest individual contributions the Alliance had received that year. I said it felt like the right amount. She said it was. Mama's portion, there was a separate allocation for her specifically, per the settlement terms, for the harm done to her directly at the pool. I offered to her in a phone call, explaining it carefully. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Renee, I don't need their money. Send it somewhere useful." I said, "Mama, this is your money. They hurt you." She said, "I know they did. I'm fine now. Send it to that alliance you told me about." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I am 75 years old and I know my own mind." I sent it to the alliance. I told them it was from Dorothy Mae Williams. They sent her a letter of acknowledgement. She keeps it in her Bible. In August, the 2nd August, the pool anniversary, Mama floating, I brought the letter to the pool with us. Not the apology letter from the board. Mama's letter to me, the 3-page one with the pool pass folded inside. I had read it so many times the paper was soft at the folds. I brought it in my bag, wrapped in a Ziploc because I will not let it get damaged, and I didn't take it out at the pool. I just wanted it to be there. I wanted the 2 letters, hers to me, theirs to her, to be at the pool together on the anniversary. I don't know why exactly. It just felt right. Symbols matter when they're true. There was a Saturday in late August of the 2nd year, just an ordinary Saturday, no particular occasion, when I was at the pool by myself between Mama's visits, a book and my coffee and the afternoon sun. I had been in the water for a while and was back in my chair, drying off, reading, when I realized I had been sitting there for 45 minutes without once thinking about citations or filings or board votes or Sandra or any of it. I had just been at the pool, reading a book, in the neighborhood where I live. Took me a moment to recognize what that was. That was what normal felt like. I had forgotten. I stayed an extra hour. The documentation file came up in conversation once at a board meeting. Carl Webb mentioned, in the context of the new citation review process, that it was useful to have a homeowner who understood documentation so thoroughly on the board. Imani said, "Renee has a file." Phil said, "How big?" I said, 148 pages. Carl said, "Of what?" I said, "Of everything that happened." There was a pause. Then Carl said, Is it a model we should be using for our official HOA record keeping? I said, probably not in its current form. But some of the principles, yes. We added it to the agenda for next month. Neighborhoods improve incrementally. That's how they work. The last time I saw Harriet Bloom in person, she had her binder under her arm at the spring block party. I asked if it was still the same binder. She said she'd had to get a new one. The original was full. She was now tracking the new board's governance for the same reason she tracked the old one. Accountability requires continuity of attention. I asked if she planned to retire it eventually. She said, when there's nothing to track. She said this entirely without irony. I asked if I could buy her a hot dog. She said yes. We stood by the grill and talked about nothing in particular for 20 minutes in the May afternoon, and it was very nice. If there's one piece of advice I've come to give to everyone who calls me now, the Veronicas, the families mid-fight, the people who are still in the documentation phase, still trying to figure out if what they're experiencing is what they think it is, it's this: find the Gerald. Every situation like mine has a Gerald somewhere in it. Someone who is already inside the system, already paying attention, already uncomfortable with what they're seeing, and who just needs someone to give them a reason to act on it. Your complaint, properly documented, properly submitted, can be that reason. Find the Gerald. They are there more often than you think. They are waiting often for exactly you. I am a registered nurse. I spend my working life with people in the worst moments of theirs, in the gap between fear and what comes after it. I have held hands of people who didn't know what was going to happen next. I have been the person in the room who knew something difficult had to be said and said it anyway. I have learned, over 20 years of that work, that the moment people need most from another person is not rescue, it's presence. It's knowing that someone is there and is not going to leave. That is what the best people in this story gave me. Gerald, Marcus, Patricia, Patty, Tom, Harriet, Amani, Cassie Marsh, who gave me her card at the pool, Gloria Tate, who finally said what she knew. They were present. They did not leave. Everything else followed from that. Mama is coming in July. I have already put the sheets on the guest room bed because I know her and I know she'll say not to, but I want them fresh when she arrives. The pool pass she gave me is in the documentation file on page 148. Her swimming cap, the one Marcus sends in pairs, both sizes, is in the bathroom cabinet of the guest room because that's where she left it and I haven't moved it because it's hers. The hydrangeas will be full by July. The pool will be open. The gate code works. Nobody will say anything to her. She will put her feet in the water. She will float on her back with her face to the sky. The afternoon will be ordinary. Every ordinary afternoon she gets in that pool is the whole thing. It is the whole reason. It is every page of the file, compressed to one image, one moment, one ordinary afternoon that was always rightfully hers. This is the house at 14 Birchwood Lane. The shutters are blue. The hydrangeas are seasonal and reliable. The guest room has a window that faces the backyard. I bought it with 20 years of night shifts and overtime, and I cried in the parking lot of the title company when I signed the papers. I cried because I was proud and because I was frightened and because it was mine. It is still mine. It was always mine. Nobody was ever going to take it, but it took 19 months and 148 pages to make sure that was true in every sense and not just the legal one. Now it is true in every sense. I live here. I belong here. The gate to the pool opens when I badge in. The board meets without a gavel. Mama has a room. Marcus calls on Sundays. The hydrangeas do what they've always done. I come home. Dorothy Mae Williams floated in that pool. That is the sentence this whole story comes down to. Everything else, the citations and the lien and the HUD finding and the settlement and the apology and the training and the board and the gavel and the article and the letter in 212 mailboxes, all of it was in service of that sentence. Dorothy Mae Williams floated in that pool. Face up.
Kapon.
Eyes closed. Entirely, completely, irrevocably at ease, entitled to every second. In her daughter's neighborhood, which is also hers, which is also ours, which was always ours from the moment I signed those papers and would have been ours even if I hadn't. It just would have hurt more. It hurt enough. And it ended with Mama floating. That's the whole thing. That's everything. I went back to the pool the following Saturday alone, just to sit. Nobody came to the gate with a clipboard. Nobody asked for documentation that didn't exist. The water was clean and still, and the afternoon light came in at an angle that made it look like something worth painting. I put my feet in. I read my book. Around 3 o'clock, 2 kids came barreling through the gate, making the kind of joyful noise that used to make HOA presidents pick up their clipboards, and they did a running jump into the deep end, and the splash reached the edge, and I moved my book, and they shouted sorry, and I said it was fine, and it was completely, obviously, ordinarily fine. Marcus called that Sunday like always. I told him about the pool. He said, "Just sitting." I said, "Just sitting." He said, "Nobody." I said, "Nobody." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Good." We talked for an hour about nothing in particular. He asked about Mama. I said she was fine, she'd be down in July. He said he'd try to come up the same week. I said he should bring Popeyes. He said that was a given. He said, "You okay?" I said yes. He said, "I know you are." He said it the way Mama does, not as a question, as a confirmation. Like he'd checked and was satisfied and we could move on. We moved on. We talked about football and his work and a show he was watching and the traffic on 64 and whether I'd fixed the gutters yet. I had not fixed the gutters. He said I should fix the gutters. I said I knew. We said good night. He hung up. I put the phone down. The house was quiet. I was home. The file is closed. The apology is signed. The pool is open. The hydrangeas are on schedule. Mama is coming in July. Marcus calls on Sundays. The board meets without a gavel. This is the house at 14 Birchwood Lane. These are the blue shutters. This is the neighborhood. This is the community. This is the ordinary life that was always supposed to be here, on the other side of everything it costs to get here, waiting like hydrangeas wait, patient, seasonal, reliable, exactly on time. I am home. I have always been home. It just took 19 months and a federal investigation and 148 pages and my mother floating in a pool for everyone to agree. And to Sandra Pruitt, wherever you are, in your new neighborhood with your gavel and your pearls, perhaps looking for a new board to chair, perhaps recalculating in front of a new gate. I have nothing to say to you that isn't already in the file. The file is real, and the finding is real, and the apology with your signature is real, and the families whose names are in the 43-page review are real, and my mother is real. And she floated in that pool, and she will float in it again, and there is nothing you can do about any of it, ever, because it is on the record, and it is done, and we are still here. We are still here. The hydrangeas are in bloom. The END.